Thank you very much. So this is a meeting of the Property Tax Advisory Council's Education Subcommittee. Today, we're going to be taking a closer look at some of the options that I think are on the table for being forwarded to the full PTAC, which, as you all know, meets again on the 4th of June. The objective for today's meeting is to if at all possible, winnow down the number of options we have, and then so that we can identify those and focus our effort on those going forward. I do see that all members of the subcommittee, except for Council Member Vasika, are either here, or in the case of, I don't see, I see Director Beatty is here as well. So this ought to be an interesting meeting. We have quite a bit on the agenda. That's why we're starting so early. And I thank you all for getting up early. And I'm sure that, like me, you've had a couple cups of coffee by now. We may end up taking a break midway through this, just in the interest of handling excess coffee. With that being said, first thing on the agenda is a discussion of how we might increase voter participation in decisions regarding levy elections. And Mr. Melton has put together a presentation on this, and I've invited Regina Plettenberg to provide a response from statewide from our election administrators in regards to those things that would have impact upon those county election administrators. That being said, I'm going to mute myself and turn this over to Mr. Melton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee. Am I able? I think I'm able to share my screen. It does appear that I can. So I'm just going to pull up that PowerPoint, make sure I have the right one of the two. Can everybody see that okay? If anyone can't see it, yes, let me know.
We can see it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just run this slideshow, talk a little bit as I go here. So the first thing to be aware of is that the Montana School Boards Association partnered with the Montana Association of School Business Officials, the Montana Rural Education Association, the Montana Quality Education Coalition, and School Administrators of Montana last session in working, and it was really a reaction to, rather than a proactive involvement in drafting Representative Hopkins' bill, the 774. But we decided that we were going to do our best to kind of work and identify the problems associated with a November election and the substantial changes that would have to occur in the way that school budgets are built in order to make that happen. So the PowerPoint that I've got here today is simply a sort of a recap of where we were and what we went through. So House Bill 774, which in your electronic version of the handout there has a link into House Bill 774. And I believe that in its last iteration, before state Senate administration, it was close to, but still not in the form that we had requested. And specifically, we were concerned, even at the forefront, of having unintentional impacts on partners, counties and cities and others that would be running elections. And so we had sort of a standing disclaimer that we felt that we could make this work with or without any change in the law with regard to counties. And just so that you know right now, the status of counties' administration of school levy elections, and the counties have been very generous and hardworking in assisting our members, is that the county can say yes or no. And the school district can ask the county if they want to administer. If the county does choose to administer an election on behalf of a school, then the county election administrator performs all of the roles. It's sort of a blanket anywhere you look and that says the board of trustees shall, or the district clerk shall, is now in the hands of your county election administrator. So that's just sort of a backdrop of which you should be aware. And, we understand the interest in a consistent higher turnout, finding the right place where we can get as many people who want to voluntarily come and participate in the election. You probably heard my accentuating that term, because I really do prefer, and I think we prefer, finding the right election where people already voluntarily turn out in sufficient measure for people to be satisfied with the legitimacy of the result, not necessarily as enthused with the other alternatives we're discussing here today, but I certainly will do my best to give them sort of a fair summary of issues there. So our current system of funding and adopting budgets starts with these really significant deadlines that go right through as early as beginning in January, with the number of days that you have to first identify whether you're going to run an election. You might say, well, that's easy. Just run the resolution and walk away. And elected trustees are not built that way. They don't like to cry wolf. They don't like to say, well, I don't know if we'll need an election or not, so I'm going to tell everybody we're going to run another election on them. Voter fatigue, the Levy election fatigue is a real thing there. And so we already sort of feel like we're pushed up against the edge of what we can accomplish under the current system. But in order to build your budget and know what part a levy is going to play, the first and most important thing you have to know is, what is your budget at A and B? A and B is the number of students that's included in a calculation. It's a historic average over 3 years, or the greater of that amount, or your current student count. But in any case, you need to know what that count is going to be in order to figure that out. You also need to know, in legislative years, what the legislature is going to appropriate for schools. And it seems like second nature for us to go, well, don't we always find that out in early March? Yeah, since 2015. But from 1865 until 2013, it happened on the last day of the session. And I'm only slightly exaggerating, pretty close to that K-12 education, until I think it was actually then Senator Jones's Senate Bill 175 that broke through the logjam and created this new culture of the legislature really taking pride in funding the inflationary adjustments for schools as one of their first significant acts. So every session since 2015, and kudos to the legislature in this regard, this was with Democrats like Denise Hayman and Republicans like Sue Vinton and Bruce Grubbs and Representative Beatty. I should reference them all as representatives, and I apologize for that. Representative Beatty, Representative Anderson, every single one of them managed to get that bill to the finish line and on the governor's desk in late February or early March. But that doesn't always happen. And even then, you still need to know, what are your parameters for your maximum budget? And that's a combination of what the legislature funds for schools and what your budget at A and B is. And you don't know your budget at A and B. You may know what you think it's going to be, but until OPI gives you the go-ahead and says, yeah, we agree with you, your enrollment count in October was such and such, and your enrollment count in February was such and such, and the average of those two is your budget at A and B, then you don't even know what you're going to do or what you could do with a levy. So that, I just want to set that stage for an awareness of how difficult this would be to just shoehorn in and say, well, just run the levy election in November. In November, before you even know what the legislature might do, because they haven't even convened yet, or what your enrollment count is, other than the first half of it. You might be able to make some sort of a guesstimate as what it might be ending up in February, without an awareness of how you might impose your non-voted levies, which has a May 31st deadline. It just doesn't work, does not compute, is the way I would put it. However, now, I want to also point out here that one of the things that I think is an existing flaw, that whether we have November elections or May elections, something's got to give here in terms of the growing shortfall that we're seeing in funding of the inflation factor, and the inadequacy of that inflation factor as it was originally configured. And I was participant in drafting it in Senate Bill 424 in 2003. With a 3-year rolling average and a cap of 3%. And if you look backward at that time over 30 years, the average was 3%. And that's in part why we put it there. But you look in the far right column here, and I want to distinguish between the excellent work that the legislature has done in funding K-12 base aid. And if you drew these numbers backward over a 10-year period, they'd look pretty good. But most of the legislature's increased funding for schools has been devoted to property tax relief. And you might say, well, gosh, you know, didn't we already finish our work? Can't we just abandon this committee right now? Because the legislature has actually decreased property taxes by over $100 million a year compared to what they would be under the GTB formula that existed before the legislature did their good work and grew that GTB ratio to decrease property taxes. But that second to the last column shows how much overall K-12 base aid grew compared to inflation. And we're now running into a 5-year period of time with a 6.9% deficit. But the real deficit is the inflation factor on the formula elements that create budget authority, spending authority for school districts. And that's that far right column. And folks, at 11.2%, you know, pick your poison. That's in the neighborhood of $100 to $141 million a year, depending upon whether you're talking about the state share, the base budgets, or the general fund the general fund budgets of school districts, or the maximum general fund budget. So, you know, one of the things that we get gravely concerned about, if the intent is to make it more difficult to pass a levy, is that the levy might be our saving grace. But I'll come back to this particular issue. I just want you to be aware that there is a significant amount of interest and I think constitutional interest hanging in the balance in terms of what we may do if it's intended to make it more difficult to pass levies that are a necessary and integrated part of the funding formula to meet the constitutional obligations of the state. So I've already gone through these, you know, at least most of them, the October count, the December deadline to get your certified FTE in, and that drives the quality educator payment, which is, you know, about $47 million. So lots of stuff hanging in the balance there in terms of figuring these things out. February, Monday in February is the second of those 2 enrollment counts. That is 92% of a school district's general fund budget is driven by the enrollment counts in October and February, and that November election falls right in the middle of them. And you might say, well, don't we have all these new funding formula elements? And we do, but honestly, they don't mount up to a hill of beans, to use one of my dad's old terms. The funding formula before all of the new entitlements were added by Governor Schweitzer in 2005 was 93% per A and B and 7% special ed. Today, it's 92% A and B, and the rest is split between special ed, quality educator payment, and the other smaller state-funded entitlements. So trustees have to, even right now, in the midst of all this, they have to adopt a resolution calling for a levy election 70 days before its occurrence. And it's just under the line to where, unless you want to force school districts to cry wolf every year and say, we're going to run a levy election, and then you don't run it, but everybody remembers that you said you were going to, and that feeds into the narrative of how many levy elections we're pinging people with. You just barely have enough time to convene based upon draft information only, because OPI might change your A and B count in order to decide whether you got enough enrollment growth or too much enrollment shrinkage such that you're going to need a levy to get by. I already talked about March. June is an important consideration, but it's one that is very important. It's the deadline for non-renewing your non-tenure staff. And since 85 to 95% of a school district general fund budget is tied up in staff and primarily teaching staff, this is an important and critical deadline, because you need to know whether your levy failed or did not at that time to know what's left. So when you read in the recent news reports that one of our AA school districts, I can't even remember which one, I believe it may have been Helena, it was either Helena or Missoula, but laid off a slew, 50 or so, non-tenured teachers, because that's your pressure relief valve. Okay, so these are all critical budgeting deadlines that do not work with a November election only in even years. So we do have a proposal, and as of yesterday, I got recommitment from every one of my partners that we remain engaged and supportive and collaborative and interested in continuing to work on a construct that that would work with a November general election in even years. So those groups that I talked about earlier are on board with a reiteration of the critical steps that we identified here. And the first is that November election is going to have to be about an entirely different issue. It can't be what can we collect next October based upon factors we won't know until this February at the least to get your A and B count. It's going to have to be based upon some kind of an estimate. That means you're not going to be giving everybody an exact identification of the impact on a house of a particular value, because you're going to be estimating. You're going to say, if I were to use last year's certified values for the next 3 years, this is what would happen next 2 to 4 years. Let's say that you provided schools with flexibility to impose those elections at either 2 years or 4 years at a time, which is part of what we're recommending here. Elections under this current system, you'd have to run that election without knowing what the calculation of inflation is, without the certified values, what the legislature may pass. And so, obviously substantial changes that would be needed. We believe that creating funding formula growth for a school district's adopted general fund budget that matches that passed by the legislature is a critical and prerequisite step. And I actually believe that this is a critical and prerequisite change that we have to make in the current funding formula if we don't want to have constitutional problems. And I think they're already in our lap at an 11.2% deficit on inflation. Currently, under that funding formula, only 80% of the base budget grows by inflation. So that if you've got an over base budget, and you fail your levy or you don't run your levy, you can actually drop within the window of spending. So let's give you an example, maybe one from the Bitterroot area. You might have one of those relatively high growth suburban communities with low tax wealth who are gun shy about running levies, and they choose not to, and they're at 85%. At some point, they're going to drop to like 81 or something. They're never going to drop to 80 because the state-funded entitlements will keep them at least whatever their current over-base taxes are above the base budget. But as the budget continues to grow on the 80% portion, but they can't correspondingly grow their actual budget by a commensurate amount, they're going to lose. And they're going to miss inflationary costs. So not only do we have a 3% cap on the inflation that is not working, but if you're a district at maximum, let's just do the easy math here. There are a significant number of districts at maximum budget. The average is 97% of max. If you're at the max and the legislature passes inflation of 3% and you don't run a levy election and your enrollment is stable, you get 2.4%. Because you're at the maximum budget and you only get 80% of the inflation. So this basically creates a redundancy. It's basically, may we please fulfill the will of the legislature in having passed an inflation on the formula that isn't guaranteed up through the entirety of the formula. Why is that important? The definition of quality specifically says you have a funding formula that is self-executing and includes a mechanism for an annual inflationary adjustment on the formula, not on a subpart thereof. So that's one of the key issues that would have to be addressed. We'd have to simplify that question on ballots. And I think what you would do if you did this, if you're worried about voter fatigue and you allow school districts to complete the inflation that's adopted by the legislature, so asking for nothing more than simply fulfilling the will of the legislature as it moves through the entirety of the formula based on where you are in that formula, is you would simplify that question, and the only question for general fund levies would be for those districts who want more than what the inflation adopted by the legislature would be. And trust me, the number of ballots would shrink considerably. There's no one that ran a levy election for more than what they could this year based upon the commensurate growth in the formula. Nobody tried to go from 85 to 97, okay? So if you had that in there, I think a significant number of those levy elections would just completely drop off altogether. And I would propose that if you were in one of those circumstances, that the law should allow a district to run that for as little as 2 or as many as 4 years. So, you know, you see the sample question I've got down there that would be identified. We think it's important to have limited and necessary exceptions. Unless you want to basically measure the increased cost of construction in 2-year increments, you got to let districts go when they can, when the bond rates are down, when they're able to find a deal on construction. There's no time after today when building to building is going to be any cheaper than it already is today. Construction costs are escalating significantly and have escalated, and it's impossible for any of you who have been involved in a commercial project. It's impossible to have a building designed by your architect, walk out, put it out for bid, and come back without finding out that the costs are in excess of what the architect thought it might be. That's how quickly costs escalate. Another exception that we believe would be necessary would be unforeseen emergencies. That's a pretty high bar, by the way. It's like a storm, an insurrection, fire explosion, community disaster, something affecting the health and welfare of the trustees, students, or district employees, or educational functions. It might be a boiler going out or something like that. And then school safety levies to ensure that we can keep kids safe if a new threat comes on the horizon that we had not contemplated, or threats become prevalent in areas where they never were before. We believe that those are necessary exceptions. We also see a series of what we would call nickel and dime pestering elections that already have parameters set forth in law that prevent abuse, and that also have exceptions that often swallow the rules. So it doesn't seem sensible to us that the opening of a junior high school only in districts with a county high school should require voter approval, when you can open a junior high school in any other district without voter approval. Purchase or sale of property. Purchases already have to require that the site be suitable, accessible, convenient, in compliance with DPHHS, building codes. There's also an exception that says you don't have to get voter approval for a purchase of property when it's contiguous. Sales of property already have an exception that largely dictates what districts do when the district has to basically decide that its property is obsolete, abandoned, unsuitable for school purposes of the district. There's a 15-day waiting period. There's an opportunity for a challenge with a abbreviated process in district court. I don't recall a single time in my career when a taxpayer challenged a declaration of obsolescence. So sales of property already occur largely without voter approval. And then transfer of money from fund to fund, we believe that should be in the authority of the elected Board of Trustees exercising their fiscal responsibilities. So you'd convert trustee terms from 3 to 4 years. You'd stagger in the initial elections to preserve that avoidance of a majority being up for the election at any time. That's under existing law. You would elect trustees in November, and they'd take their office first Monday in January, just like legislators do. You change the evaluation and renewal cycle for the superintendent, and I would add the clerk in there as well, district clerk, to coincide with the expiration of those terms. Increase the allowable length of a superintendent contract, again, to coincide with the election cycle. Right now it's 3 years because that's the term of trustees, and it should be 4 years if the term of trustees is 4 years. That's sort of a partnership. A board hires a superintendent to basically personify their collective will on the ground. And we believe that should coincide with the terms of trustees. And then change the annual organization to January, change the adoption of the budget to June from August. I don't think that's actually a big deal either way. You might have some that would say, gosh, really, that might be a bridge too far for us. And I understand that. but you will have all of the information you need when you have the outcome of the election in November, potentially for 4 years out. And the only thing you'll be waiting for is your February enrollment count. And you'll already have an inflationary adjustment commensurate with the funding increase adopted by the legislature. So you won't be asking to complete the inflation. The election, the information you would need to adopt your budget would be available, reasonably available to do so in June rather than in August. We recommend that you delay the effective date to allow for a transition, and you'll have to work out the issues as to the extent of impact on counties. And I'm grateful to have a colleague here that Representative Beatty has brought in to talk about that part of the puzzle. And we don't talk about that part of the puzzle. We understand and respect the needs of the counties to watch out for themselves and determine what barriers might exist to from their point of view on this particular topic. Now, Representative Beatty, I can pause right now before I jump into voting thresholds and passage rates, or I can continue with the remainder of the presentation. Let me know.
Thank you, Mr. Melton. I think this is a good time for you to pause and catch your breath. The takeaway I would have from this is, as Lance has pointed out, we're going to have to carefully consider inflation adjustments in the current school funding formula. Certainly that may require some stopgap actions during the upcoming legislature, and is a incredibly important topic for the decennial study that will commence right after the legislature is out. I was going to have Ms. Plettenberg weigh in, but I see that Mr. Iverson has his hand up. So, Dwayne.
Yeah, I got one question. If you change the terms to 4 years for the trustees, you're going to have a switch in power because you're either going to have a majority elected one of the periods of election, or if there are an even number of trustees, you're going to have one of the existing trustees probably be chairman. And so that would give the incoming ones the vote to change policy and stuff.
We have that current, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, we currently have that drafted in House Bill 774 staggered over 3 two-year cycles to avoid that very contingency.
Wouldn't the terms have to be longer than 4 years to do that?
No, not through initial staggering.
Okay.
Anything else, Mr. Iverson? So the other takeaway from here, from Lance's discussion that I have, is that moving school elections to the November general election is a complicated process. But Mr. Melton's view, that I'm just going to recap it briefly, is that it's doable, but with extensive changes in law and policy that would need to accompany that. So and of course, recall the whole objective of this, or the objective that we have in this venue, is to increase voter participation in mill and bond levy decisions. Obviously, there's a cost associated with that in terms of getting it off the ground. But there's also questions of implementation for election officials, and that's why Ms. Plettenberg has been invited. And Regina, I would like for if you'd like, please respond to both what Mr. Melton has said and give us your perspective on the challenges to implementing this switch.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and all the members here. Yes, so there are challenges for the election administrators. Our biggest concern is boundaries. Currently, the school boundaries don't match the House and Senate boundaries. And Brett Rutherford, who was the election administrator in Yellowstone County for many years, he and I, if you go back to the districting and apportionment committee discussions when they first got going, this last time. We did talk with them because this has been an ongoing question and discussion about combining these federal, it used to be the primary, now it's the general elections with the school. Because, and I get it, we have the May election for the school and turn right around and we're mailing a ballot out for the primary, so we understand that. But we talked to them and said, hey, if there any way, and I know their job, I don't even want to, I would never want to be on that committee. I think what they do is monumental. But we said, if you can you consider school boundaries when you're looking at these House and Senate boundaries? And you wonder, why does that even matter? Well, as you guys see right now with this primary ballot going out and 4 ballots, just those 4 faces, times that by however many, I have 25 precincts. I felt like I had ballots coming out my ears this time. Times that by another 25, because some of these boundaries could create another 25 boundary, splits and ballot faces. That increases that printing cost, that programming cost. And I know many people say election costs don't matter, and that's fine, but our concern beyond the cost is error. One is error. The more ballots you have, the harder it is, not just for my staff, my temp workers, but my election judges at the polls. And giving out the wrong ballot. And then also some of these splits are going to create just a tiny number of voters in an area. And so they may only be 2 or 3 voters. And if only one of them votes, now we have to worry about protecting voter secrecy on how they voted and making sure we don't give out information on that voter. So those are the concerns we have. I hope you guys don't reconsider House Bill 774. That bill was very horrible from an administration standpoint, because it also included special districts. And then you add a whole other layer of complication and different boundaries to the mix and different requirements for voting, because special districts get very complicated. They're all different. So I'm glad it seems like we're taking special districts off the table now, and I hope they stay off the table. They really, really need to. I've polled my group and in my county and throughout the state, special districts rarely run levy elections. So I think those are very specialized. I think I've had one irrigation run a bond in the 25 years I've been doing this, and just a handful of my fire districts and no one else. So I really hope we keep special districts out of this. Our group did work actually with Superintendent Arntzen. She came to us and wanted us to say, hey, how could you move elections to a federal? And she did us a great favor by bringing in Sherry Skur. I don't know if any of you remember Sherry, but she used to be legislative staff, wrote a lot of election law. She was the queen of it, really, once upon a time. And she came out of retirement and helped us draft House Bill 784 last session and LC 4246. 784 was an attempt to just start moving, and this is another concern of ours, is the school district timelines. They're terrible for running a federal. They just won't work, honestly. Candidate filings 40 days before the election. Under federal law, we have to have UACAVA ballots available 45 days before the election. So that's just another consideration that Mr. Melton didn't touch on. I do appreciate everything that he did. And we do know school funding is huge, not our concern, but we know it is a stakeholder concern. And so with that LC 4246 was actually our attempt to ask for a task force to move forward and look at, I'll just read a few things from that. It was, to look at funding, to look at boundaries, to look at timelines. And so we just wanted to get everyone together because that is going to be a huge change for our school districts. Their timelines are vastly different. And so that's something we wanted to make sure that we went over with them and we were all on timelines that would still work for the school districts, but meet our timelines for federal elections, which are very different than for school elections. Our attempt too with House Bill 784 and moving the timelines a bit was to encourage more clerks. That's the other thing we're hearing is I run all of my school elections here in Ravalli, but I'm going to tell you, it's tough. Even if you don't run it by mail, even absentees right now throughout Montana are at about, I want to say 78% of the voters. And so that's why a lot of my clerks came to me and said, please run my elections. I just don't have time with all the absentees. It's just getting to be overwhelming. And so I do it, but it is tough to try to get those ballots printed and out at the timeline because we only get about a week and a half between the filing deadline, the write-in deadline especially, and getting ballots not just printed, but actually ready to mail. So it's tough. Many times schools miss the EAs may miss the day by a day or two just because it's so tight. So that's something I think that has to be looked at. But we're willing to come to the table, but the boundaries, and then there's single member districts, and I don't even understand all of this, but I know that there's several counties. Richland County is one that really stands out that I don't have a clear understanding. Mr. Melton might be able to explain it more, but there are just some districts that their boundaries are so complicated and their school structure that would just be another consideration that I think we'd have to look at. So I agree with, I know Mr. Milton was saying that we would have to have a delayed effective date. We would have to change terms. And I agree with all that, but I think there's going to be other things we're not even thinking about, like the timelines and filing deadlines and things like that we need to consider. So that's where our group is. And one last thing too, just for everyone to think about, that general ballot gets long as it is. We get all the state and federal and a lot of times county ballot issues on there, along with all the different candidates. A lot of us are looking at going to a 17-inch ballot just because currently we're all going to not just a second side, but a second sheet. And a lot of those second sheets don't get returned. So that's our concern, is we're trying to maybe look at going to a longer ballot so that voters aren't missing those ballot issues, because that currently does happen in general elections. And so now if we go to a second sheet, but we add more to the ballot, if you go to a longer sheet, then where does it, I don't know. I just wonder where that, what that does if we then have to add a second sheet anyway. And of course, school issues are going to be towards the end of the ballot and would be on that second sheet. And then if voters don't return it, are we really helping the situation? So just something to consider.
Thank you, Ms. Plettenberg. Any questions from the committee for Regina? I don't see any hands up, so another alternative we have to look at is putting some sort of turnout requirements or something like that, or passage rate requirements on bond and levy mill levy elections. There already in statute are such requirements for bond elections. Mr. Melton has worked up some ideas on this as well, and I'll turn it back over to him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try to make sure that I've got the right deal up. I believe that no, I'm up on Uniform Mills. Sorry about that. Let me stop that share. Come on now. Let me find the other. Let's see here. I'm sorry. Give me just a sec to find this, okay? I have to close out my other screens here. All right, let's see here. Cancel that. All right. Technical errors here. How about that one? We back on the passage and turnout rates? Is that where we're at, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, let's see.
That's what I see.
Okay, good. Thank you. So I'm going to start from that slide and we'll go right back in here. So, I want to start by just noting that MTSBA believes that there are significant problems with deliberately increasing the difficulty in passing school levies that are currently hanging by a thread as it is and are an integrated part of meeting the basic system of free quality schools. However, have to acknowledge that the U.S. Supreme Court in Gordon v. Lance in 1971, and that's been shepherdized up to the current law. The court validated the ability to establish an overall uniform passage rate. So they reviewed the West Virginia state constitution and state law both. So it didn't hinge on whether or not this was embedded in the Constitution. It was a combination of West Virginia's state constitution and their state law that required a 60% passage rate for all bond elections. And the court specifically noted that fact. So they had a previous ruling in '69 where the court found that a topic specific, it was fair housing, supermajority requirement violated equal protection. But in the Virginia case, it was for all bond elections and tax increases required a 60% passage rate. And the court validated that. What might a universally applied turnout or passage requirement look like? You could structure it in multiple ways, but one of the frameworks exists in current law under 29-428, a school bond. So it basically says if the turnout's 40% or more, then you get a simple majority. If it's between 30 and 40, you have to have 60% passage. If it's 30% or less, it's rejected. Now, none of that is exactly what the court validated in Gordon v. Lance, but the 60% portion of it certainly does. There was no invalidation for a particular turnout issue there, but the supermajority was validated in Gordon v. Lance, and this is on the books. So I do think that you'll have difficulty if you impose this on a selective basis, particularly given the constitutional rights of students to a public education under Article 10 of the Montana Constitution. But the other exception under current law is if the election is held in conjunction with that general election, then a simple majority governs. So school district only turnout requirement, I do believe would have potential constitutional problems. There is a specific guarantee of equality of educational opportunity. There's a people's goal setting the stage for a public system that can develop the full potential of each person. That's the state's obligation to provide for the basic system of free quality schools and not just a portion of it. And the definition of quality's requirement that funding formula be self-executing with a mechanism for annual inflation adjustments. So I believe that a super turnout requirement or passage requirement on the basis of a levy election question, which is only for the purpose of fulfilling the will of the legislature adopted in the inflation formula, is going to be have a constitutional frailty to it. I'm not telling you that's a slam dunk in any way. I'm not even telling you that we'll necessarily be the party that would be challenging it on that grounds. But I think that these specific and extensive guarantees that the Montana Supreme Court has repeatedly validated make singling out school levy elections for special treatment or even using a supermajority turnout requirement for general fund levy elections that are absolutely necessary to complete the ability of a district to provide the definition of a basic system of free quality schools is going to run afoul of Gordon v. Lance. So I think that overall, if you had a uniformly imposed turnout requirement or passage supermajority passage rate below a particular turnout requirement, you got a U.S. Supreme Court case to lean on there. Again, hopefully I don't sound too unenthused here, but given the fact that in the entirety of in my entire career, I have never seen levy elections for the bare necessities for fulfillment of the legislature's adopted inflation fail at these rates. And it doesn't, the rate of passage doesn't even bother me as much as the number that had been put up. So, look at that, 36 elementary and 23 high school levy elections reported. And it's a pretty good survey. We get a fairly good threshold once we go look at the news reports and such. It's pretty accurate portrayal. And then I've never seen the passage rate fall below 70% until this year. Up until the Great Recession, passage rates were in the low to mid 90s. The day after election was like my birthday every year. I got to put out a press release about the overwhelming support, and that overwhelming support as a result of voter fatigue, which is part of what we're talking about here, has turned that down. And so, I've been around since 1996 and I've never seen anything like it. So on that bright, cheery note, you can probably tell I'm not exactly the most enthused advocate for this concept, but one of the things I think would be absolutely necessary is to recognize that with the average school district out there being at 97% of maximum budget, the prevailing expenditures appear to be at least at about 97% in order to provide the basic system of free quality schools on the average across the state. And there are 110 school districts that are above the maximum budget right now out of that 400. And I think if you create a supermajority turnout requirement or passage rate in the current system, with districts required to get voter approval to complete what the legislature ostensibly already adopted, you got problems. I think if you were to say every type of election except a school district general fund levy election, I think it would be much closer and easier to defend. If you allowed school districts to increase their funding in the overbase portion commensurate with the legislature's adoption of inflation, and districts were only going for extras on those levy elections, I think it would be even more defensible yet. In any case, bringing it back home here, because I'm an opponent, I have to give credit to the fact that there's a U.S. Supreme Court case that validates super majority passage rates in the particular scenario under Gordon v. Lance.
Thank you for the even-handed presentation, Mr. Melton. I will say that here, if I'm hearing Lance correctly, and he reiterated this a number of times, we don't have a constitutional issue here with moving forward with this, so long as we apply these requirements across the board to levies of all sorts, which presumably would be for those run by counties or cities or special districts, et cetera. The issue with respect to the funding formula and the fact that on average we're at 97% of max, I think these are interesting questions. Clearly, this may bear upon ability of districts to move above what the legislature has determined to be the minimum level of state and local funding required. The base funding that's required is one I think we should contemplate. But once again, I love kicking the football over to the decennial study, because I mean there are deep structural questions with the school funding formula that I think need to be addressed, and that's the reason that we have a decennial study. Are there any questions from members of the committee or from Ms. Plettenberg? I guess before I ask for the committee, I'd ask for your take on this as well. I mean, from an election administrator standpoint, do you have any response to Mr. Melton's presentation?
Well, for us, having the minimum turnout is not that's really not a problem for our group. But I will just say, I mean, and I'm just being a little bit of a devil's advocate here, but what I've seen in the past, if there's not a minimum turnout, what would prevent the schools from not putting the levies on the federal and just doing it on off-year or special elections that don't require a minimum? Aren't we back to right where we're at? So I'm sorry, I just have to bring that up to the group to think about.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to rebut that one. So let's get this straight. You can't accommodate us in the November election, but we should find some way to get into the November election, or find some other way to get the turnout requirement that you don't care about, but that we can't access because you don't want us on your November ballot.
That's not what I'm saying, Mr. Melton. I'm just saying what would prevent that? I'm just asking because you know what I mean?
I'll start with 1,450 elected people that I represent who take an oath of office and who serve as volunteers without compensation. I see the whole idea of accountability far different than most people, and I'm hearing that today again. I don't mind being that guy who says that again and again and again. There's nothing better than elected officials. I represent more of them than anyone else here on this screen or anywhere else in Montana. They're a good bunch of people, and they serve well, and they do the right things.
So I think this is a very interesting back and forth, and I'm going to jump into the middle of it right now. I think that you know, the notion of moving elections, school districts moving elections and having special elections on general election day or primary day. I mean, certainly you can do that. I don't think that's. I think the problem what I see here is a separate ballot and a separate mailer going out, and you end up with exactly the same sort of situation you have now with the ballots. I don't see that necessitating the issue or forcing the issue onto the general election ballot. But I think that both Mr. Melton and Ms. Plettenberg have made their points sufficiently here. Are there any questions or comments from members of the committee? I know that we have public comment at the bottom of the agenda, but and I will offer opportunity for public comment at the end of this meeting. But in the interest of kind of keeping things compartmentalized a bit here, is there any public comment right now on this topic? Both of which, one of which is the turnout thresholds, and the other has to do with moving school elections to the November election. If you're out, I think I see an attendee with a hand up there, and that would be Mr. Story. If someone could ask Mr. Story, I think you're ready. You can speak now.
Thank you. Thank you, Lance, for the great presentation, and also the Ms. Plettenberg. I guess I'm not a fan of moving things to November either, just because of the complexity of getting there. But some things to think about. You know, you talked about ballot fatigue, which is, you know, lots of different elections, or election fatigue, I guess, but ballot fatigue has kind of been a studied topic and talked about in the legislature before, and that's what was referenced earlier. When you get a long ballot, people tend to never get to the end of it. You know, they vote the federal elections, they vote some of the state elections, and then as you get farther down the list, they don't vote those elections either. So you still have the turnout, but you still don't have people voting. So I think that's something you need to consider if you're going to move these to a general election. But the issue I have with Mr. Melton's proposal is that to make this work, you would have to allow the trustees more latitude in permissive levies, basically, you know, to get their inflation adjustment in the 80 to 100% window, and those types of things. So basically you would be allowing for tax increases without a vote just because it's expedient under that system. I do agree with Mr. Melton that our current funding system needs to be reworked when the bulk of the schools are, when the 80% is supposed to fund the definition, and the bulk of the schools are trying to fund it at 97%. You know, the decennial study is going to have to work with that issue. Another concern I have, I guess, is if you move the superintendent's contract back to December 31st, basically the old board is going to more than likely extend the superintendent's contract, and then the new board comes on and is stuck with the guy. You know, I don't know if that's a good plan. It's kind of that way now anyway, but if you're going to change it, then I wouldn't. I would let the new elected trustee decide if they were going to extend the superintendent's contract. Most of them are already out 1 or 2 or 3 years in front of the time frame anyway. I think Mr. Iverson was right on, if you have a 3 trustee board, which a lot of them are, and you have elections every 2 years and 4-year terms, you're going to have 2 of them up at one time, no matter how you stagger the beginning of it. Unless you go to 6-year terms, you can't, you're going to have 1 elected one even year and 2 elected the next even year. It's just math, I think, and Lance should be better at math than that. The talk about the number of ballots you'd need, because I think Billings has single district school board seats, you know, so they have 5 or 7, something like that, in Billings, and then they have the rural ones, or 2 that represent the rural elementary districts. But then you have all the House districts in Billings and the Senate districts in Billings, and then you would have to have figure out how these single district school board elections would work on those ballots also. So I mean, this is just almost overwhelming in the amount of things you would have to do to try to make this work. My suggestion to try before you do any of this is just put a stamp on the mailed out envelopes or ballots and see how that helps with return. You know, a lot of people get them and look at them, and you know, so 100% of the registered voters almost have a ballot in their hand. It's just, how do you get them to return them? And it might be as simple as putting a stamp on it. I think that there is some concern constitutionally about if you put too much requirement on whether you can meet the state constitutional requirement of adequately funding schools. But I think on Mr. Melton's slide that he had about 4 things on there that were constitutional. Most of those were things that the court ruled. They're not actually in the Constitution. They're rulings that the court made in the adequacy finding, and the state complied with almost all of them except for the inflationary adjustment isn't self-executing. That's a legislature decided that they wanted that money reserved in the governor's budget, but it doesn't happen until the legislature actually implements it through a bill. So just, you know, some of the things are sort of constitutional because of a court's ruling, but they're not actually in the Constitution. And I think, let me check my notes here if I hit everything I wanted to hit. Yeah, I think that's about all I have on that issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Story. Based on what I'm hearing here from public comment and from some of the questioning that's gone on here, I would recommend that we not move forward with moving school elections to November election in terms of the work that the PTAC is doing. At this point, I'd ask does any member of the committee have a contrary view to that recommendation?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have a contrary view, but we remain interested in never being characterized as opposed to the November elections in order to escape the voters' will. That was why we came to the table on House Bill 774. And by the way, if you go look at our version of the bill, you'll see there is no problem with 3-member boards because there are no 3-member boards. We turned them into 5-member boards because 3-member boards are already a real problem the first time somebody gets on the phone with somebody else. But in any case, as long as we're not on record as being somehow averse to the idea of stepping up to the plate and gathering the public's collective will in the November election, we're good to go.
Thank you, Mr. Melton, and I think it is clearly on the record that the School Board Association and its associated partners believe that nothing is impossible, but some things are incredibly difficult. And Ms. Plettenberg emphasized the difficulty on the election administration side of that. Seeing no objections from members of the committee, we will take this particular option off the table. Next option to consider on the related topic is currently by law, we do have some turnout requirements that apply universally to bond elections. It would seem to me that there is no reason why we should not consider applying the same or similar requirements on mill levy elections. It's already been demonstrated that this is would not be or is not likely to create a constitutional problem so long as we universally apply that. My recommendation would be that we forward this to the PTAC for further consideration as one of the options to bring forward and to work as we move towards our mid-July deadline to have a draft together as an entire committee. Is there any objection from any members of the committee?
Mr. Chairman, just being on the record, I object. I think that proposal with the current duplicity in the inflation formula that is neither self-executing nor at face value, and then make it more difficult for a school district to even put a question before it's public as to whether they should be able to complete the collective will of the legislature previously adopted is bad. It's bad for public schools. It's bad for kids. I completely understand why this committee might forward it, and I hope I'm being civil in identifying very clearly that we absolutely object and believe this is terrible public policy.
Thank you, Mr. Melton. Your objection, it would be noted. Senator Morgeau.
Yeah, I think Lance put it pretty well. I'd probably be in that same boat, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any other objections? This is a weird way to vote, by the way, but I'm doing it. Seeing no further objections, we're going to move this option forward. I will draft up what the recommendation looks like, and I will also note the objections that were being made. Just as an administrative note, my plan is to try to use the format that was prescribed for us for making recommendations, put together, draft a recommendation, and send it out to members of the committee for their perusal next week before it gets sent to the full PTAC on the 4th of June. Thank you, Mr. Melton, for excellent information that you provided, and Ms. Plettenberg, thank you for joining us. I know that you have other pressing business that you must attend to. Appreciate your contribution.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Okay, with that being said, we're going to move on to the next item on the agenda, and this has to do with the state school levy, the so-called 95 mil levy. Before we get started on this, I want to clarify something that I heard at the, I guess it was last week's or the week before last, the Revenue Interim Committee met, and there were a number of questions about what happens to excess 95 mil levy money, and specifically, does it flow to the general fund? And the answer to that is no. All 95 mil levy money flows to the schools and to the school districts. It gets there through equalization. It passes directly through indirect state aid. it is in the calculations for the 587 expenditures of additional revenue that is gained above the 587 parameter. That money flows to the guarantee account, which in turn flows to the schools, because that's the first source of funding for state aid to the schools. So just to be very clear, 95 mil money or the state levy money, which is 95 mils now, flows back to the districts in one way or another. None of it flows to the general fund, where it could be co-opted and used for other purposes. Now, that being said, I've asked legislative staff, you've heard Ms. Pattin before, to run some numbers on current law as it relates to the GTB and distribution of money to school districts. You'll see that the main players here are the district general funds, which are the operating funds for a school district, whereby they pay for O&M and salaries and that sort of thing. And then the retirement fund, which is a countywide fund. Ms. Pattin, I've run out of breath, so I'm going to have you take it from here.
Thank you, Chairman Beatty. I will start by sharing my screen. So, I have several different kind of sections to this presentation. I'm going to start with some background on GTB and the scepter. Most of this should be recapped from the training at the beginning of the task force, I think back in February. But just because GTB is complicated and the scepter account, which receives the 95 mils, is complicated, I figured some recap would be good. So GTB is guaranteed tax base aid, and it equalizes revenue generating capacity by providing a state subsidy. And so when we talk about revenue generating capacity, we really mean a ratio of the property wealth or taxable value in the district to the funding needs and costs. So when we talk about the district general fund, we really mean the GTB area in the district general fund. And so essentially, if you look at this graphic, you have several different districts here, and their revenue generating capacity we're kind of thinking of in the green, and GTB will essentially fill up districts to a guaranteed amount. That's that black line. So districts that have revenue generating capacity above that, they're not receiving GTB aid. They're receiving other forms of state aid for education, but they're not receiving GTB. And then the districts that are below the line, get the amount that they need to raise them to the line. That's different for different districts, as you can see. And so when we talk about raising the GTB ratio, or, on the flip side, lowering the GTB ratio, that's going to change the height of that line. So if you were to raise the GTB ratio, you would probably make districts B and H eligible for GTB aid. But depending on how much you raised it, you might also make A and I eligible for GTB aid. And so I think this graphic will be helpful as we talk about what it means to change the GTB ratios. This slide shows kind of another way to think about GTB a little bit more in context. So GTB is providing support for low tax value or high student areas. In this example, I've picked two more rural school districts. They're both K-12 districts, so they're relatively comparable. And the enrollment's not exactly equal, but it's in the ballpark. So you have Ennis K-12 schools with A and B, which is a proxy for enrollment, at about 425 kids versus Superior at 351. And if you're familiar with where these two are located, Ennis is located, of course, in Ennis, Montana, in Madison County, and the Yellowstone Club is part of the tax base for the Ennis K-12 school district. But because it's more rural area, you've got, a smaller number of kids attending. And so you have this ratio of high wealth and lower numbers of kids. To contrast that, Superior is, I believe, in Mineral County, and it's along, the district is along I-90 where there's a lot of federal forests that are non-taxable. And so really the amount of taxable land and taxable value there is really low compared to the number of kids. And so you have these vastly different tax bases supporting a similar number of students. So you'll notice for Ennis, the total taxable value in the district is 191 million versus 5 million in Superior. But if you have a comparable number of kids, you may have similar costs to funding those schools. Because the district general fund is largely based on enrollment, not entirely, but largely based on enrollment. So when we look at the base levy revenue for these two different school districts, you're looking at 1.2 million for Ennis and about 250,000 for Superior. And again, you can look at the mill values. The mill values are vastly different. So in order to raise the base levy revenue that they need, Ennis is levying 6 mills and Superior is levying 48. And that's just to get them to their base levy revenue, because Superior is already receiving GTB aid. As you can see, that's 790,000. That essentially brings it up to about the same funding level as the Ennis K-12 district. So if we didn't have GTB aid and we needed to raise, let's say, $1 million for each school district here, so that's in the levy revenue column of the second chart, and neither district were to receive GTB, this is not the case, but this is a hypothetical. In order to raise the same amount of revenue for a similar number of kids, the number of mills that Ennis would need to levy is 5, and Superior would need to levy 192. And so what GTB is really doing is helping equalize the tax burden for education between these two different areas with vastly different tax bases. So then when we talk about the SEPTR account, that's the school equalization and property tax reduction account that receives revenue from the 95 mills. There is a mechanism in statute, and this should hopefully look pretty familiar, where 55% of any increase in the 95 mills is going to go toward reducing local levies via retirement GTB. So we've got two different types of GTB we're talking about here. We've got GTB in the district general fund, and then you've got GTB in the county retirement fund. And so the SEPTR account kind of bypasses the GTB in the district general fund. That the GTB in the district general fund is at a higher level than in the retirement fund. And so as the 95 mills bring in more and more revenue, over the next several biennia, there will reach kind of a cap at the retirement GTB level that's in statute. And then there will be an overflow so that any more of the increase in the 95 mills will go towards state major maintenance aid, which isn't exactly the same as GTB, but it's kind of GTB-like. And then from there, it'll overflow into debt service assistance. And so again, the 55% was chosen as kind of keeping a balance between state and local funding for K-12, but then also property tax and other taxes in the state general fund, like income tax, in funding K-12 education. And then just to note that when you have a reduction in revenue, not necessarily a reduction in mills, but an actual reduction in revenue, then the countywide retirement GTB, and if it's a large enough reduction, the base GTB in the district general fund will be dialed back and shift the cost back to the local taxpayers. So I think this slide gets to Chairman Beatty's point about the 95 mil levy. Here in this column chart, we are just looking at state funding for the district general fund and the retirement fund. We're not looking at local sources. We're just looking at what those two funds are receiving from the state. And if you'll notice, the 95 mills, this is for fiscal year 2023, so it's about $350 million. But the 95 mills, the entirety of them show up there in the state funding column for the district general fund. And if you'll notice, they're not even contributing the entire amount. I mean, there's a substantial amount coming from the state general fund, which is income tax primarily. Additionally, on the kind of right-hand side of the screen, you can see the 3 different statutes for the 33, 22, and 40 mil levies that make up the 95 mills. And you can see that in those statutes, they are specifically dedicated to education. And And then finally, if you're looking at fiscal year 2024, we don't have finalized data, we do have estimates. But you can actually see that appropriation in House Bill 2, which is the main state funding bill. If you look under the state special revenue column, that's the SEPTA account, you can see about $426 million under K-12 base aid. And that has a restricted designation, meaning that it can't be used for anything else. It specifically has to go through OPI, the Office of Public Instruction, and flow through OPI to the school districts. So I think there are some misconceptions about how the 95 mils are used, but especially now that they're in the SEPTA account, they do entirely go to fund schools. So then if we look at the essentially base funding or required funding for the district general fund and the retirement fund, you can see the section we just saw on the previous slide is that kind of yellow, the periwinkle, and then the green. And on top of this, we've added the orange, which are the non-voted levies. So in the retirement fund, those are your county retirement mills that are non-voted. In the district general fund, those are your base levies, essentially to get all the school districts up to base. I did not include the over base levies, which are voted in this chart. So just to be clear, if you're trying to add things up to the total school budget, you're going to be missing the over base levies in this chart. And so you can see the various funding sources for the general fund and the retirement fund, at least to get the general fund up to base. And a good chunk of that is coming from the state, at least in the district general fund. So looking at this same chart, there are a couple things I'm going to point out. One is that in fiscal year 2024, you can see that the 95 mils brought in more revenue than in fiscal year 2023 and decreased the amount of state general fund, which is again primarily income tax, needed for school funding. So if you look at the differences between the first column chart and the second column chart, you'll see the periwinkle jumps up and the green decreases. Then in fiscal year 2025, you'll see that while the state levy, the periwinkle, 95 mils, is about the same as fiscal year 2024. It's a little bit bigger. 2025 was a non-reappraisal year, but the GTB formula in the district general fund has a lag where it's based on prior year taxable values. And so as that lag catches up with the value increases for fiscal year 2024, you'll notice that there's a greater amount of state general fund, again, primarily income tax, going into the base budget for the district general fund. And as a result of that, you'll notice that local levies, base levies again, in orange are squeezed down a little bit. That's about a $20 million difference. And then in addition, in 2025, you have the implementation of the SEPTA kind of dialing mechanism. There was I like call it hard-coded increase for fiscal year 2025. So it's not based on a formulaic calculation. It's $33 million. But that calculation will become formulaic and kind of automatically be calculated for 2026 and beyond. But you'll see that in the retirement fund stack there on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. When you compare it to 2024, you'll notice there's a much bigger portion of state general fund or income tax and a decrease in local levies, which are in orange. And so the way you can think about this, or another way to think about it, as kind of an overflow. So what the SEPTA account dial did was, instead of saying like what happened in 2024, where if there's an increase in the 95 mils, it just decreases income tax in the district general fund, where it squeezes down this green portion here, you get kind of an overflow where, yes, the 95 mils offset this state general fund in the district general fund. I know it's tricky with the two general funds, but you can think of the state general fund, at the state level, and then each district has its own district general fund. But this amount of state general fund flowing into the district general fund will overflow into the retirement fund instead of just getting squeezed down. So essentially it's allowing the retirement fund to capitalize on some of the increases in the state levy, or the 95 mils. So I was asked to run some various scenarios about how that scepter dial. So again, we're talking 55% of the increase in the 95 mils going to the retirement fund. And then also the base general fund GTB ratio. So in this slide, I've kept the base GTB ratio for the district general fund constant at where it is in current law at 262%. And what I've changed here are the dials on the scepter account. So how much of the increase in the 95 mils are going towards reducing property taxes in the county retirement fund. And you'll notice if we look at the three different scenarios, so you've got fiscal year 2024 and 2025 on the left-hand side of the screen. Those are essentially estimates for this biennium. You would need some legislative intervention, likely in the 2025 legislature, to change that 55% to 75 or 100. But if you made that change, you have, kind of three scenarios on the right-hand side of the screen. You've got the current law scenario at 55%, and then you've got the 75% option of the scepter dial, and then 100%. And so you'll notice it's subtle, but the little orange boxes that are outlined in black here that are the local levies for retirement. And so those decrease a little bit. It's about $6 million with each change as the scepter dial is turned up to 75% and then 100%. So you can see the delta here in the table where if you turn the dial up to 75%, you get an additional $6 million going to squeeze down local retirement levies. And that's an increase in what the state is paying out of the general fund in income tax. If you go all the way to 100%, it's a $12 million difference. So you squeeze down local levies by $12 million, and then you increase the state contribution by the same amount.
Julius, pause there for just a minute.
Yeah.
Are there any questions on this particular slide? Because what we're trying to, Julia's trying to illustrate here is what, number one, what current law is doing with full implementation of House Bill 587, and also showing us some options for changing the parameters in the scepter account. An observation I would make, I think, that is perhaps more striking than the right three sets of columns is the change between 2024 and 2025 with full implementation of scepter. It's too bad that scepter, we had a delayed effective date on scepter because that would have manifested itself in 2024. Those changes would have manifested themselves there. That is probably it's certainly not as subtle as changes to the scepter dial that are illustrated for 2026. Any questions or comments for Julia before she moves on? Okay, Julia, go ahead.
So the second set of scenarios I ran, I kept the scepter dial kind of constant here. And at 55%, that's the current law, and then change the base GTB ratio. So you have 262%, which is current law, and then 275%, which is kind of a loose calculation of essentially where some of the more tax value wealthy districts start to receive GTB aid. And then the third scenario here is, it looks a bit absurd to see this 2,650% for the GTB ratio, but it's kind of a hypothetical of what if, the legislature wanted to essentially bring all districts to base, so funding everyone at that 80% mark, the base budget, with the GTB formula. And one of the things to note here is the GTB formula is complicated. So if you do this and you dial up the base GTB ratio, you're retaining the complexity of the GTB formula because it's a per mil subsidy. So you'll notice there's a tiny little box at the top there that is local levies for the base budget for the general fund. And again, that's because it's a per mil subsidy. So 2,650% is basically bringing every single school district below 1 mil for the base general fund, which again seems seems kind of silly, but it was a mark to say how high can this ratio go to fill every single district up to base.
So, Julia, just because I think this does look remarkable, I'm going to make a confession here. I asked Julia to run a number like this. So if it looks remarkable and foolish, please, it's not Julia. She's remarkable, but not foolish. I think the problem that you have with that particular, this was shown just to show just how much money it would require to do this. And you see what the tax shift of the state general fund would be in order to pull this off. It's a significant tax shift that's going to income taxpayers. But probably and I think Mr. Melton can probably he'll either correct me or substantiate what I'm about to say. If you look at the 2,650% option here, what you've basically done is you've eliminated equalization between rich and poor tax bases. Mr. Melton, do I have that right?
Yeah, I think there's a simpler way to do it, but yeah.
Well, certainly, and you will probably tell us what the simpler way to do that is. But I think that we ran this case just to illustrate what the limits are. If you were going to if you're going to use the GTB ratio as a mechanism to reduce local taxes, then there's a limit on just how far you can go with that. And that option illustrates what that limit is. That's the reason that I asked for Julia to put it on here. I not only am I not advocating this, I actually oppose this particular option. So Julia, please continue.
So yeah, I think Chairman Beatty pointed out something important, which is that this essentially shifts the cost from the base levies, which are local non-voted levies, to the state general fund, which is primarily income tax. So there's kind of a shift in who's paying here. Because there's, in these kind of previous columns, there's kind of a balance between the 95 mills and local levies that are contributing and the state general fund, primarily income tax. And so ramping up that GTB ratio so dramatically just changes that balance. If there are no questions on this slide, I'm going to go to the next slide because it kind of shows the two previous slides together and how those options affect state funding. So essentially, this is a matrix showing the interaction of changing that scepter dial from 55% to 75% to 100%, and the base GTB ratio from 262%, which is current law, to 275%, and then this really large 2,650%. And so these effects are really just additive because they're not interacting together. But if you're looking at change from current law, your change is, of course, zero. We're comparing these for fiscal year 2026 to what the difference is compared to current law. So if you just bump up the scepter dial to 75 and you stay with your base GTB ratio here, you're seeing that $6 million that we talked about on the first of the two scenario slides. And similarly, if you bump the scepter up to 100%, you see that $12 million difference. And then if you go down this first column, you see under the 55%, your current law for the scepter dial and your base GTB ratio being moved from 262 to 275 and then 2,650. You see the two numbers that you saw on the last slide, that $7 million difference to get to 275 and then the $130 million to really fill all the districts up to base with the GTB formula. And then in the next four boxes, you really have the additive effects of those two. So if you did the scepter dial at 75% and the base GTB ratio at 275%, you'd have a $13 million difference. If you had the scepter dial at 100, but the base GTB ratio at 275%, you'd have a $19 million difference. And then, of course, if you were to ramp that base GTB ratio all the way up to 2,650%, you see that big jump with that $130 million difference. So you're looking at $136 million if the scepter's at 75% and $142 million if the scepter's at 100%. And just to ballpark these, I don't remember the exact calculations, but This $136 million is about a 10% difference. And this $12 million is about a 1% difference from the current scenario. So you're looking at options that are ranging from like a 0.5%, 1% here, and then a 10% or, you know, even 12% difference here. So it does take a little bit to move the needle on some of these calculations, but I mean, every single change that you make, whether it's the scepter dials or the base GTB ratio, they're going to have an impact on your local levies. And those are reductions, of course. So the final thing that I was asked to look at was how the scepter mechanism would work if the 95 mils would be reduced in fiscal year 2026. So the reason I talk about fiscal year 2026 is because legislative action would be needed to change the 95 mils to 79 and to remove the mill banking mechanism. So if the 95 mils or the state levy were reduced to 79 mils and then were to float from there, I ran the scenario with the scepter dial at 100%. So you're kind of maximizing the effect of the scepter, which is the 95 mils reducing, or I should say the state levy here, reducing local property taxes. Say that change was made in the 2025 session. You see a decrease here in the periwinkle for the state levy. And again, you'll see a corresponding increase in income tax and your local levies. When you run that forward a few years, if the state levy is at 79 mils and that amount floats, you get very minimal effects from the scepter dial, just because there's not a large difference year over year in the amount brought in by the state levy. So as funding for the base budget will grow, that's going to be largely accounted for with local levies and state general fund, which again, we can think of as primarily income tax. So you'll see that happening in the district general fund. And then if you look down at the retirement fund to see that kind of scepter dial calculation, beyond the hard-coded change for fiscal year 2025, you won't see a whole lot of change in the retirement fund to reduce local levies, because this, again, the scepter calculation is based off such a small difference year over year, that it doesn't have a massive impact in the retirement fund. So there is a chart over here on the right hand or left hand side of the screen that shows the change from fiscal year 2025. And you can see that reducing the 95 mils to 79 reduces the state levy revenue by about $50 million, $54 million in fiscal year 2026. And then as it grows, again, because we're comparing to fiscal year 2025, that difference gets a little bit smaller. And then you can see the changes in the state general fund, again, primarily income taxpayers, kind of backfilling that in fiscal year 2026, backfilling the reduction in the state levy, and then also accounting for growth going forward through fiscal year 2029. And local levies in the final column also pick up some of that burden with the state levy being dialed back in fiscal year 2026, and then to account for growth going forward. So I think that's kind of all I have to say about that. But if there are questions, I know this is a lot of data to kind of be thrown at you. So if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Julia. Any questions from members of the committee?
Mr. Chairman, is it okay? Is this the appropriate time to make any comment?
Absolutely.
I just, one of the things I know from having worked with Representative Jones on House Bill 587, that he had a pretty strong belief as we were looking at all of these different constructs, that there's a point of diminishing returns, and by that expanding the GTB ratio any further, the way we, at least the way we looked at it during the session, was that we were going to tilt that balance beyond. I like how Representative Jones sort of simplifies that and says, when you get up to the point of where you're covering about 70% of the bucket, your job is done. And if you go any further, you're going to start giving money back to people that don't really need it. And you're going to be somewhat wasting the money in that effort that could be better put to improving further on the tax equity for people that really do desperately need it. And I saw Julie identified that where we were reaching that particular point at the 275, but at least I don't want to speak really for Representative Jones unless he can come and confirm I'm right, which I think he will at some point, is that the 262% not to exceed was a pretty important consideration. And I think that if you look at Julia's illustration during her presentation here of Ennis and Superior, you kind of get that whole point there. At what point are you picking up pennies but spending dollars to get there? And even with the current level of support from the state in that GTB formula, it's almost run its course because in spite of spending $250 million each year to equalize, we still have 51 versus 0 out there.
Thank you, Mr. Melton. Are there any other questions or comments from members of the committee? And Julia, I think your slideshow disappeared on my screen.
Do you want me to bring it back up?
Please do, because people may ask some questions, but please do bring it up. If there are no questions or comments from members of the committee, I'll open this up to questions from the public, questions or comments from the public. And I'm looking for hands. Mr. Story, you're on.
Thank you. Again, another great presentation. I think that probably the obvious point of Julia's presentation and what Mr. Melton will talk about later with his show is that if you're going to fund the full 80%, just fund it. Don't mess around with some complicated formula of guaranteed tax base. The state's going to put the money in. I think, in my view, there's a misconception about that the state needs to collect property taxes to fund schools. The state's obligated to fund their share of the schools, whatever they decide that is, with any source of revenue they have, and they just chose to use statewide equalization mills to do that, and there's good reasons for that, but it's not any unbreakable bond. You could fund it all with income tax money. If you had a sales tax, you could fund it all with sales tax money, whatever. The legislature chose in 1993 to gather up all the equalization mills and create some more and use that to fund their share, and we're working with that. But what I will say is this 587 concept of the best part of 587 was putting the equalization mills in the SEPTA account so that they were identifiable. Now, I do have a question, and it's technical, is that, when the legislature appropriated that $400 and some million that Julia showed on her chart there, that's what they assume the 95 mills will bring in. Now, it'll bring in more than that or less than that, and I don't know if the mechanism is in 587 or just in the General Appropriations Act, that if you bring in less money than the, say, $450 million, the general fund has to backfill that with income tax money. And if you bring in more money than that, does that stay in the SEPTA account, or does that reduce the general fund or the income tax, the general fund obligation to fill that full appropriation to OPI? Because you have to do it one way or the other, or is that just done through a supplemental when you get back into the next session? And that's just a technical question. But the problem with 587 is it's pecking around the margins. It's collecting money, the delta in the 95 mills, the extra money it collects, and it's going to give a portion of that back in tax relief through the retirement GTB. But if you look at the numbers Julia showed you there, that you're talking about $6 million a year, maybe $12 million a year. Some number, I don't know. That's not a lot of mills, you know, that's in some districts it's more than others, but on a statewide basis, a mill is $4.5 million. And there's kind of this discussion went on yesterday in that fairness subcommittee about overpromising tax relief. Remember, the purpose of these subcommittees to lower property taxes, not raise them, or not, you know, they're going to shift them around apparently. But if you don't have a lot of growth in the 95 mills, and the growth in the 95 mills under current law in the first year of the reappraisal cycle is inflation of value of residential and commercial real estate. And in the second year, it's new property, because the state doesn't get inflation as long as they're bumped up against the 95 mil cap. And so you have a big bump one year and a pretty small bump the next year. And I don't recall what the number of dollars newly taxable generates to the state and on the 95 mills every year, but it's somewhere between 12 and 20 million, I would guess. So if you flow 55% of that back through to tax relief, you're again talking $6 or $12 million, 3 or 4 mills on a statewide basis. And that the obligations of that retirement account are growing every year by whatever the teacher salaries grow. And so a lot of the tax relief is going to get eaten up by growth in revenue demands on that account. And you're going to go back and tell taxpayers that, yeah, we did this great thing and gave you tax relief, and they'll say, where is it? And I think the other risk that you talked about is, will equalization mills bring in less money next year than they did this year? Well, not next year, but in fiscal 26. Well, if the legislature goes through with the plan that's coming out of tax fairness and reduces the taxable value of owner-occupied residence and long-term rentals, if they do that in a way that decreases statewide taxable value, you may actually have a reduction in the 95 mills. You will certainly have a change in the taxable value of every school district in Montana that has to be dealt with, and that'll either change GTB or change local mills needed to fund the local effort. But again, it gets back to when all of this stuff gets put together in the end and the proposal goes forward, and a bunch of taxpayers think the legislature did something for them in tax relief, and their tax bill comes out and it's pretty much the same or more than it was last time, because you had a new reappraisal come into effect, and then all of these changes didn't offset that. They're not going to have much faith in the work that's gone on here. But I think you've got some good things to look at. It's just, I'm not certain you're really talking about a lot of money in the final scheme of things, unless you really redo the school funding formula and put more revenue in the system that is not property tax revenue, because any property tax revenue you do to reduce somebody's taxes is an increase on somebody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Story. Is there any other public comment or questions from the public? I'm not seeing any hands raised. So on this particular issue, I agree with Mr. Story that we're at least when we're looking at current law and making the adjustments to current law that have been suggested here, we are not talking about much money. And perhaps since there's uncertainties in terms of making projections even 1 year forward, that the numbers are small enough that they might be lost in the noise, so to speak. And so here clearly, even if we were promising $6 million or $12 million worth of relief, that certainly on a statewide level isn't substantial. And as Julie pointed out, it's about a 1% or less reduction, would lead to a 1% or less reduction. That being said, I think that what a takeaway I have from this is just what the effectiveness of 587 is with its full implementation in terms of containing and tax growth going forward. It seems to me that that's perhaps underappreciated, but I think that one of Julia's slides made that pretty evident. Then we take a look at the idea of in 2026 reducing the 95 mil levy to some other to a number. We chose 79 because that's the one that happened to be out in the public this year, and then float it from there. And Julie, if you could bring that slide back, please. As Mr. Story has pointed out, and I have pointed out on a number of occasions, tax relief will come at the expense of some other taxpayer. And as you can see here, the move to a 79 mil levy in order to cover the state's obligation, but so that in order to cover the state's obligation to meet the funding formula's requirements, requires a pretty substantial increased demand on the state general fund. And although this property tax subcommittee is tasked with looking at property tax relief, it is certainly not outside of the scope of our considerations to consider what impact it will have on income taxpayers and on income tax policy moving forward here. I'm also sort of struck by the amount of how we get a reduction in the state levy moving forward, but also have a corresponding shift of taxes to local levies as well. That is once again, assuming present law is in effect. We certainly don't seem to be getting the sort of large tax reductions that people might be expecting. So with that being said, we have actually, I think, have two items on the table here for consideration for further action or to move forward, or to put it differently, to move forward to the full PTAC. Let me start in reverse order. I know there has been some interest in reducing the 95 mil levy and then floating it thereafter. Is there anyone on this call who supports that particular on the committee that supports that particular course of action? That's the one that's illustrated on the slide that is up right now. Seeing none, then let me tell you what I propose to do, and I'll ask for objections. I propose that we remove this option from the table and consider it no further. We can report out the same to the full PTAC on the 4th of June. And I think the basis for that is it creates it creates a demand on income taxpayers that might not be acceptable, because after all, most property taxpayers are income taxpayers as well. And it also does not appear to provide the sort of relief that one would, large relief that one would expect or might be expecting from reducing the 95 mil levy because of its impact on the local share of base education funding and retirement funding. So seeing no objections to that, we'll take that one off the table. Let's move on to current law 587. I would propose here that we report out that that current law is I'm trying to articulate how I would report out to this. I think I would recommend that we move forward with current law with the and consider changing the dial number on the scepter account just, unless someone unless this group would rather just move forward with current law as it is. After all, as Mr. Story pointed out and the numbers illustrated, we're not talking about very much money here. So perhaps the best option now, as I'm rethinking this, is to simply is to claim credit for how current law has changed the situation with full implementation of 587, and let current law ride for another biennium to see how this pans out. Boy, that was long-winded, but Mr. Melton, maybe you can help me out of this verbal salad that I just tossed.
I usually add to it, but a couple of comments here. I think it's actually, even when you do something pretty remarkable, it gets lost in the minutia. People don't pay attention to the macro issues, and it doesn't always translate into the micro issue. And the illustration of lowering 95 mils to 77 as though it was going to somehow fundamentally alter everybody's existence at the time it was proposed. And then by the time it was supplemented back, some of the bills were so small they weren't worth the postage to send them. That's a disconnect here. And the other thing is that the partially what the Scepter account does, and I know this is a little bit hidden there, but it actually captures and protects and preserves some really remarkable work that the state did that already shifted the responsibility away from taxpayers to the state general fund to the tune of over $100 million a year. And at some point we've got to say, okay, how much of the growth in the 95 mils has to still go to tax relief? And I guess I'm making a pitch here for current law, versus how much has to still be available to help feed the formula in some measure. And the truly the difference, and I haven't taken it all the way through current year, but at the last time I looked, and it was as of last year, from 2017, in a school district general fund budget that's $1.2 billion, base levies only went up $15 million, while the state's GTB grew by over $100 million. Now it just curbed back to $248 million, but it's going to go back up in FY25. Nobody knew that. Nobody knew it. Nobody cared. Honestly, it didn't solve the issue. So I would make the pitch that when 95 mils revenue is bringing in $440 million now, and it might grow further. And the current deal here, if it was a perfect world, I'd take that 5 off and make it 50%. 50% to ensure that we keep after the property tax, and 50% to make sure that there's at least some contribution to the state's $900 million plus and growing obligation for K-12 base aid. So that, I don't have terrible heartburn with the property tax task force considering whether to turn the dial up to 75 or 100. If we were looking down below and saying, shall we move the GTB ratio to 275? I would urge that we not do so. So again, maybe I've added some word salad myself there, but I think that there's a reasonable pitch for letting House Bill 587 run in the configuration as it currently exists. This last legislature took what Representative Jones proposed, and which originally had a third of the increased future revenue going to tax relief. And the Senate Finance Committee chose to up that to 55%. So, we'd almost have another column here. It says 33%. HB 587 is introduced. The last legislature executed its will and increased that to 55%. And I don't think turning the dial up any further is going to make much of a difference in anybody's world. And I think in the meantime, the amount by which the state has to support schools and K-12 base aid is twice the amount of money coming in from the 95 mils and growing.
Thank you, Mr. Melton. Mr. Iverson, I think I saw your hand up. And then
I think to simplify it, what both of you are saying is let's let 587 run. It's doing a good job.
I think that that was very succinct, and I appreciate you offering that, Mr. Iverson. Is there any objection to Mr. Iverson's suggestion? Seeing none, we will report that out to the full PTAC on the 4th of June. And I'll make sure to note the impact of full implementation of 587, which will have a market effect in 2025. Mr. Iverson?
One thing I'd like to say is these presentations have been excellent in getting to understand what's going on and all this stuff. You've simplified it. I think that I give kudos to everybody that's put this stuff together because it's very good.
Thank you, Mr. Iverson. Before we move on to the next item, which I think will be of great interest, because now we're starting to get into some of the more out of the box thinking, we are going to recess until 10 a.m. sharp on this on the clock that's in the lower right-hand corner of the screen of my screen, which hopefully is synchronized with everyone else's. So this meeting is now in recess. It will reconvene in about 5 minutes. Nancy, if we can get to. Thank you. So the next item on the agenda is to take a look at replacing the district base levy, which is a mandatory or by law levy that's calculated within the funding formula, taking GTB into account, and replacing that either with countywide base levy or statewide base levy. Mr. Melton has done some work in this particular area, so I'm going to turn this over to Lance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint there. I think everybody can see that okay, but please let me know if not. And I'm going to just kind of run this out here. Everybody see that okay? Is it large enough on the screen for you?
Good.
Okay, great. So the first thing, just talking about uniform mills to fill the base budget, it sort of harkens back to one of the slides that Julia showed with a GTB having to go to 2,750% or something like that to get up to that base budget. And there has been previous consideration and repeated validation of the propriety of considering uniform imposition of base mills to fill the base budget. And so the first slide here is just gives you a link to House Bill 625 that was passed by Representative Musgrove. And again, that committee rejected countywide uniform levies in favor of a statewide levy, in particular, because they felt that there was nothing educationally relevant about county boundaries, but that there was about either district or state boundaries, the whole state having a collective obligation to support the basic system of free quality schools. And I think it's important to also recognize that public education is not a use fee. There are people that pay into taxes in order to fund the basic system of free quality schools as a constitutional state obligation that may never have a direct relationship with that school, may not have children, may not have grandchildren even in the public school. The concept is not about use fee, but ensuring a constitutional guarantee. But this was in 2001, and there was a recommendation to implement uniform base mills to wipe out the remainder of the combination of GTB and direct state aid. And clear back then, it was 40% in direct state aid and the other 40% in a hybrid of guaranteed tax base aid and local mills. That didn't obviously happen. Representative Roy Brown, who was in leadership at the time from Billings, Republican, passed House Bill 736, which created the Public School Renewal Commission, which also came up with a recommendation for implementation of a statewide equalization plan with an emphasis on ensuring homeowner equity and uniform property taxation, and had the base budget funded using statewide equalization. So this is nothing new, but it is certainly something that that hasn't eventually gotten off the ground. So the base mills are, this is one of Pad's wonderful charts and or Julia's charts that I sort of took and stuck into the slide here. What we're talking about here is this GTB area, 35.3% of the basic and per A and B entitlements. And I called this entire area here, your mileage may vary. There's 248, I don't know why that's jumping back and forth, but I'm going to quit using my mouse. There's 248.9 million in GTB in FY24 that's going to rise in FY25, and $164 million in property taxes. And those mills, even with a commitment of $250 million from the state, vary, as Julia previously noted there, between, you know, there's 0 in some districts. And there's, I think there's three base mills in Ennis, and then all the way up to 51. When you're really looking at this, the combination of the elementary base mills and the corresponding high school base mills for some districts are 50 apart. And you may recall, we've talked previously about State v. Woodall in 1974, where the Montana Supreme Court specifically said the legislature had the prerogative to determine how to fund schools and had the right to do so through a property tax. This is part of the funding formula. And I think that there's a current constitutional frailty in there, certainly fertile grounds for a challenge when you have a distribution of what really is the state share. I know we talk about it as local mills, but it's in a formula that happens automatically. This is not a voted levy. This is not a permissive levy. This is a levy of automatic operation based on the interaction of a number of different external factors over which the school board has no control. And again, it yields levies that vary all the way from 0 up to 50 base mills. So equalizing those base mills, if you did it in a way that that would replace that portion of the formula, you would basically take the direct state aid, and of course it has guarantee account money in there, but you'd take the entire portion of this. And instead of having about 4 or 5 complicated ways of saying this is the base budget, you'd say the state funds the base budget and it uses the income tax from the general fund plus uniform mills that are across the board at 36. And I use 36 as both the combined total of both the elementary and the high school across the entire state. So that disparity that we're trying to narrow, and the illustration of what you would have to do in order to narrow it through the GTB formula, you know, 2,750%, in that's where you're chasing pennies and spending dollars. So the low mill value of 30 cents per A and B, and I know that's not necessarily a formal way of looking at it, but I think it's an illustrative way of looking at it. 30 cents per A and B in Hart Butte versus 2,765 per A and B in Alzada Elementary in Southeast Montana. That's a taxpayer gap of over 8,000% that could be eliminated through base mills. Those current base mills, as I've said, already vary from 0 to 51, despite the state already putting $250 million into it in order to push GTB through the formula, and that's a new phenomenon since 2017 in House Bill 647, when before that, all the way since the inception of House Bill 667 in 1993, GTB ratio was static at 193%. It's now up at 262%. State spending $250 billion a year. And there's still variance of 0 to 51 mills despite that valiant effort. So the interdependence of guaranteed tax base aid and local taxes, trying to understand the formula, trying to explain it to somebody that doesn't live in it every single day, just hang it up because you talk to people about 5 minutes about this and their eyes glass over, and understandably, by the way, and there's even confusion over what the difference is between a variable mill and a uniform mill, and that was accountable for the regrettable differences of opinion on 95 versus 77. Those are all complications in the funding formula here. Option one, which I actually prefer, as you can probably tell, would be a revenue neutral proposal to replace those local variable mills with a uniform 36 mills across the state. I'm using some pretty broad-based estimates that I think are reasonably accurate. Assume 4.6 million in revenue per statewide mill. I'm using the HB 587 fiscal note for that. The FY24 variable base levies at 164 million, 18 uniform elementary and 18 uniform high school mills, total of 36 would generate the same amount. By the way, let me hit the pause there and tell you that if you wanted to say, no, let's follow the same 33 versus 22, that's part of the 95 mills now, you could do this as 24 and 12. It wouldn't make any difference whatsoever in net effect on a taxpayer paying his or her taxes and expressing discontent with the level of those taxes to public policymakers. The net effect would be the same. As long as you have a total of 36 generated from a combination of the elementary district and the high school district in which that elementary district exists, you would see the play out that I'm identifying here. The way I would do this is I would remit that revenue in the same way into the same destination, HB 587, and change it so that the base budget is funded entirely by the state for each district without complications of describing DSA, GTB. Your acronyms would go down the tubes. You'd have some minor amendments to House Bill 587 along the way. Run the totals on this, had them double checked by Paul Taylor. It's pretty eye-popping. Uniformity in base mills would reduce mills for 223 school systems, educating approximately 90%. I'm a point long there. It's 89% of the A and B in the entire state is in districts that would see a reduction if you did this revenue neutral switch. And assuming that residential property tax paying individuals and people renting homes live in similar proportion to where children are, I think you could credibly say that 89% of Montanans would see a reduction in their taxes. And sometimes it would be very small. I mean, and you get to the middle of this thing and you take a look at a district that's currently got variable base mills that between the elementary and the high school come up to 37. That's a 1 mill reduction. Big deal, right? But those that are paying 51 coming down to 36 is fairly significant. It would increase the transparency of the funding formula. It would give the state an ironclad defense on equitable distribution of its share, and we'd be off to the races. So the second proposal here, and I'm actually enthusiastic about this one as well, although I think what it will do is it will make incremental progress toward further equalization, but it won't solve the underlying issues. So if you look at tax wealth per pupil across different counties, there's still a 4,000% difference from high to low. In other words, you just by going to a county GTB versus a school district, you'd cut the disparity in half from an 8,000% disparity from high to low to a 4,000% disparity from high to low. And I'm saying that with a little bit of a smile on my face because it's still pretty large there, but it would represent progress. That's half of that disparity. And so presumably a GTB mechanism would work twice as well at a county level as it does currently at the district level, but you would still have significant disparities if you have a particular county that's got extraordinary wealth and you have another particular county that does not. you'll still see some version of Hart Butte versus Alzada. Might very well be those two particular counties that that have a new comparable variance in the amount of GTB as well as the amount of effort it will take to completely resolve and stop that from occurring, the disparity that exists. The sub options here would be that you either use the current GTB formula and the ratios for school district general fund levies, and you apply them among 56 counties. You'd have to ensure revenue neutrality, and you'd have to basically amend the law to establish a ratio that kicks out 250 million a year. If you just froze in place this year and said, that's what we want to do, then you would, you'd have our fiscal staff get you the analysis, and you would commit the legislature to a continued subsidy of about 250 million in GTB support, and do so at a county level. And you would have a comparable but not identical number of winners and losers there too. So there's no free lunch here. There's no way that you can improve equity without affecting some in ways different than others. I have not penned this out to the point of finding that there's 89% that would benefit, and I don't think you will find that, but it is a less aggressive move in the same direction of trying to better ensure taxpayer equity across the state in supporting school district general fund budgets. The other way you would do this is you would abandon the general fund GTB formula altogether, and then you would go and analyze, does the countywide retirement levy work in its current form? Is there any changes that need to be made? You might adapt, overhaul, expand that formula, and then apply it to the general fund. The bottom line is, as long as you start with the assumption that you've got $250 million to work with, you're going to dial those levers in the proper way to ensure that it spends approximately that amount. So I'm going to get out of there really quick, and I'm just going to show you briefly here another, and this is one of the handouts, of course, so I won't belabor the point, but I do have the actual spreadsheet, and glad to share that with you. I think you can see what I'm looking at there. It's the change in uniform versus current variable-based property taxes. And again, what this does, I've got this stacked by counties first and then school districts in the counties, and you can see how it plays out. This elementary A and B total just counts. It's just if this column is less than 0, then count the A and B from this district, and it shows that across the whole state, 89% of property taxpayers would see a reduction, some very meager, some larger than others. You know, do you get down here and you go, okay, I'm going to see a 1.79 reduction in my mills, yawn, but you look at some of those double digits, 11, 10, you know, some of them are fairly profound, and as high as 20 in this entire list. And you can get a better picture of what's going on among different school districts in the same county. So one of the things that this chart can, or what this this spreadsheet can help you look at is where are there places in the same county where countywide equalization would also measurably solve some of these issues. And so maybe look at a Hill County where you see both winners and losers, some of the other counties where you just see you know, straight winners or straight losers across the way there. But you can sort of see what it would look like if you went in and did countywide equalization across Madison. Everybody there is, with the exception of Ennis and Alder Elementary, are winners under state equalization. And if you rolled all these up together, the wealth in Ennis would likely cover the lack of wealth in the rest of these districts, and you would have a more moderate disparity between tax-paying jurisdictions than what you have now. So, Mr. Chairman, that's all I have on that subject. I don't know if others were planning to weigh in here, but I sure benefited from having the opportunity to discuss some of these issues with Pad, who knows an awful lot about this, and was grateful for the assistance from Paul Taylor in validating. It's always good when you do your own hand check spreadsheet, then you hand it off to Paul Taylor and he comes up with exactly the same numbers. So
You're pretty handy with the numbers too, Mr. Melton. So obviously this is a large departure from the way we're doing business right now. It looks pretty promising in terms of the way the numbers pencil out. I'm not sure about how easy it will be to sell politically. That's another question. That being said, questions or comments from members of the committee? Because eventually I'm going to ask you whether we're going to should take these either one of these ideas, countywide base or statewide base mills forward. So this is a good time if you have questions of Mr. Melton or a discussion, this would be a good time to voice them. Let me turn then to our attendees and see if there's any comments or questions there. Mr. Story, I'm sure. Mr. Story, I think we need to get Mr. Story back. Mr. Story, I think you're up.
Thanks, Lance, for that research and work. I think it points out something. That's what the 40 mil equalization levy was in 1990 to try to round up some money from the low taxing school districts to help lower the taxes in the higher ones. It would be interesting to see on that chart what those mills converted to dollars. You're looking at a lot of little elementary districts with 3 or 4 or 15 kids in them that are going to raise their taxes, but I don't know how many dollars that amounts to in some of those districts. The big hitters are the coal strips and the Ennis's and those places. I guess my concern from my membership were the folks who are gonna hey, there you go, bear some of the impact of this. Are you're basically some of the reasons some of these districts have low mills is they have other sources of revenue. They're natural resource areas, they've developed oil, they have pipelines, they have that. It used to be the forest side of the state had a little more break because they had forest money coming in. And so what this kind of does is it penalizes those areas that do have resources and do develop them. And I want to emphasize do develop them to help out those parts of the state who, even if they had resources, probably wouldn't develop them to help out their school system. So that's one thing to think about. But yeah, it is a concept that's been around for a long time, and as you get more and more analysis, you can kind of see where the shifts are and what it costs to do that. And I think the shifts you basically see are from small rural districts and some resource districts into basically, as Mr. Melton pointed out, where the kids are, the urban districts.
Thank you, Mr. Story. Do you have more?
No.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from members of the committee?
Mr. Chairman, I'll be sure to, I can't remember if I uploaded that spreadsheet. As long as I can protect the cells for myself. I did try to show what Mr. Story was showing, and he's absolutely correct there. So hopefully, Mr. Story, I was helpful as you were given that narrative there, but you were spot on your comments there. And I will make sure that I get that spreadsheet to the committee.
I do believe it's already posted.
Oh, good. The full spreadsheet.
Yeah, I think, well, maybe not the full spreadsheet. You had the list.
Yeah, I think the part that's missing off of my PDF is that I went with mills, but not dollars. And I think that Mr. Story's comment about the actual difference in revenue is well taken. You know, when you're talking about, hey, Sand Springs is going to see $194 increase and Yak's going to get an $1,151 decrease, is a lot different than saying, you know, Billings is going to save 2.3 million in its elementary, but Ennis is going to pay 10 million more.
Mr. Melton, I have a question for you. Just I haven't looked at the spreadsheet itself. So when you showed the net tax difference, that's that involves both what is paid out for the state levy, as well as changes in the district levies as well. So we're netting the entire tax burden that would be.
Yeah, the proposal
question, but I guess I just want to be clear that we're not missing something there.
The proposal is 100% revenue neutral. It says if you what uniform mills would you need across the whole state, given the variable tax wealth that exists in each district, and including both the effect in the elementary and the high school of which it's a part, how would that compare to the current variable base levies that are in existence right now? And so the net difference that I show on that spreadsheet, the first one always comes to mind is Grant Elementary. Grant Elementary goes up by 7 because they currently pay less than 18 in their elementary district for their variable base mills. And Beaverhead County High pays about 3 mills less than 18 as well. So 18 plus 18 is 36, and that's 7.23 mills more than what Grant Elementary taxpayers pay in their elementary taxes and their high school taxes. And the next one on the list is Dillon Elementary, which comes out in the opposite direction, that Dillon Elementary is currently on a variable basis, levying 29 and change on mills, and they would reduce to 18, balanced against the 3 mill increase in Beaverhead County High. So I did this in a way that captures the entirety of the picture. There's no place in Montana that doesn't encompass an elementary district whose taxpayers are paying both their elementary district taxes and someone else's high school taxes, sometimes the same district. It's a K-12, then, you know, Hamilton K-12 has both an elementary base levy and a high school base levy, and you can capture that in one. In other cases, it's Trinity Elementary and Helena High School District, for example. So then you got to stack that up and say, what is a taxpayer trying to pay their bill and read their tax bill and either be satisfied or discontented with it, have to pay between what the elementary district load is and the high school district.
So this 36 mills that's necessary to do this means that the statewide levy is 131 mills then, right?
Yeah, I mean, by the time we're done stacking these things, you know, between 40 state and then 33 elementary and 22 high school, right, it basically comes up to, you know, 55 county mills and 40 state mills. And yeah, you'd raise these, but, you know, the numbers don't lie. 89% of individuals who are discontented with their tax bills would go down. And if for no other reason, I'd make the pitch, we should put it forward along with the county equalization, which I think has some merit as well, so that, hey, if we want to put this thing to bed again, you know, we did it 2 times in a row in 2001 and 2003. And, you know, I know that was a long time ago, and I don't mean to call anybody out individually, and they're not on this committee, and I'm not chastising them in any way. But when Bob Keenan votes on a consensus vote in 2003 as part of the Public Schools Renewal Commission that this was an appropriate issue of public policy, and he's still around today, he might say, yeah, I don't agree with that anymore. But the sort of the way that you had John Musgrove, a Democrat, bring that bill in 2001 and have them reach that conclusion, and then Roy Brown bring it in 2003 and have them reach that conclusion, it may still be politically infeasible, but the numbers don't lie. And I think it's worthy of a discussion among the entire property tax task force to decide whether or not we're willing to try to break through the veneer of the underlying complexities that prevent us all from better understanding the cause and effect of what we do.
Thank you, Mr. Melton. Are there any other questions for Lance or any other comments from members of the committee? Then I propose that we move, Senator Morse.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, to me, it's been really interesting kind of having it broken down like this and seeing kind of how these numbers, these are the sorts of things that I feel like we all kind of know exists, and this issue has kind of existed for quite some time. So it's nice to see it broken down the way that Mr. Melton has, and to kind of see how those numbers are. And for me, it's just one of those things that we can kick the can down the road, or we can do something about it right now. So that would just be my thoughts.
Thank you, Senator Marjo. Any other questions or comments from members of the committee? Well, I think that I'll echo what Senator Marjo said. I think that this is pretty eye-opening. I think there's a history behind this that Mr. Melton and Mr. Story have alluded to, and I think that this is both of these options are worthy of further consideration by the PTAC. I think from a political standpoint, many people, if you're going to raise for a statewide levy, raise the 95 mils to 131, you're going to get some pretty instant pushback on that. Of course, that's because there's either a comma or a semicolon in there somewhere, but that there's going to be a widely distributed reduction in district mills. So I don't know. I think that this is, unless there's objections from members of the committee, I could move this one forward, although I see that Director Beatty is on. Director Beatty, you're muted, but go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no problem bringing this forward to the PTAC committee. I do have a few concerns on just how that spreadsheet lays out. And I think it will receive a pretty serious backlash or opposition. Bottom line is I'm not sure how we do this more fairly than we've already got it, frankly, among the different districts. And pushing it off, taking more money out of Fallon County and putting into wherever, I'm not sure I like that idea, mostly because I'm a product of the 1970s and 80s school systems in Montana, and that's what we did forever. And I'm kind of a fan much more of more local control, frankly. And so I'm not opposed to this going forward. I just wanted to make sure that somebody heard me say I'm a little concerned about the shift here.
Thank you, Director Beatty. I'm sure that you will not be the only voice that raises that. I think another good reason for moving this forward is I'm going to beat the drum for the decennial study again. In the decennial study, I think will be a great time to take a look at moving big pieces around in school funding. The changes of the school funding formula that calculates obligations, and then looking at serious look at revenue sources once again. And I think that if for no other reason, I think that this particular idea, just getting it out in the public so that people have a chance to think about it, this would be a worthy use of PTAC time. And we'll find out on June 4th whether there's any interest in going any further with this. But I would ask Mr. Melton, without objection, and I don't hear any. I hear concern from Director Beatty, but no objection. I'll push this forward and ask Mr. Melton to make this presentation on the 4th of June. Mr. Melton, I would recommend that you coordinate with Director Beatty if he has concerns about the spreadsheet. Of course, we ought to reconcile those before the 4th of June, if at all possible. And I think our recommendation going forward is to give consideration to this and let the PTAC decide whether this is just too big of a load to push in the time frame that we have in the run up to the 2025 session.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm glad to do so. I want to make sure that I understand if there's concern with the numbers. I'm kind of at the end of my limit. I've calculated these specifically myself. Paul Taylor has independently calculated them separate from my calculation, and we came up with the same exact numbers. If it's a matter of display, I'm glad to work it out, but I know that the Department of Revenue has some real expertise there, and if they believe that those numbers are wrong in any way, I would certainly want to know that, but I don't believe they are.
Well, let's just, I think we can just, Director Beatty, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want anybody to think that I was alluding that any of Lance's or anybody's numbers were wrong. I have no doubt that they're good. So Lance, I hope you didn't take that as to me being critical of your numbers or your calculations. The numbers, as I think you said, don't lie. There's winners and losers. And it just depends on who we think ought to be a loser here as we squeeze this balloon of the same pot of money squished out. Somebody wins, somebody loses, and whoever's going to lose is going to be unhappy. But I am so impressed with the work that everybody has done. And that's actually what brought my comment on, is those numbers don't lie, and it's impressive work from everybody that did this.
Thank you, Director Beatty. And I guess, so my ask once again, though, is between Mr. Melton and Director Beatty, I want to make sure that there's, if at all possible, that clearly the numbers don't lie, the numbers are telling a story. As long as both the Department of Revenue and Mr. Melton and Mr. Taylor, have agreement that these numbers are right. They are telling the story, and there's not something missing there, so that we are coming forward, whether we have disagreements on how the tax shifts works or not, that this is an important enough and controversial enough one that double checking the numbers with DOR is a good idea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, so we'll move that one forward, and let's move on to what was formerly known as the Iverson option and is now called Big Sky Relief. Mr. Iverson, you're up.
Well, thank you. One thing is I'm new at sharing this stuff, and I think it'll knock me out. So it might be better if Nancy would put up the stuff I put.
Yeah, please, Nancy.
I'm on it.
If she can share that instead of me, might be better. Just when I looked at it, was gonna knock me off of the team meeting.
I'm getting there. I think.
More of a number cruncher than this type of stuff, so.
Oh, there we go. Screen share. Okay, can you see it?
Yeah, it's up. So basically what we're dealing with here, is I look at the taxes you have, local taxes, county and city. Basically, they're restricted by budget, and you divide by taxable value to get mills. They're not controlled by mills. The only thing controlled by mills is the state school system and the university system. And so with that, you look at, okay, when we do something in regard to valuation of property, we either increase the money for that fixed mill levy or we decrease it. And so when we take and lower that levy, we're giving relief to people that are not participating in the income tax system, only participate in the property tax system. So I looked at, is there a way that we can look at a deal to where people who are participating both in income taxes and in the property taxes, we give them relief versus the people that are only participating in the property tax system. Now, some of this throughout there, I refer to them as out of state, but basically the concept is how do we take care of those people that we only have two legs to the stool in Montana. We have the legs in regard to the property tax, and we have the leg in regard to income tax. And as you watched in the school presentation, we cut down the property tax collection, income tax has to pick up that difference. And so that's what we're looking at here. So if you want to go to the next one, please, Nancy. Okay, we just did that. Okay, then go to the next one after that. Okay, so that's, I guess that's where, we need to understand how we get that relief then to them. And that's where we came up with that formula that showed that here's how much you could give in property tax relief, how many dollars it would cost, and then you could take and do a percentage to people that have their all the other tax classes, and we give them relief based on the percentage of their income that's taxed in Montana would be the rate they'd get that relief. And basically what the thing does is instead of collecting additional dollars, because basically what you find is nobody's willing to propose that we would increase the taxes in order to give relief to the people, and then state people would get that relief. So I'm saying what we should look at this for is when we have excess revenue, we should, instead of lowering tax rates on schools, say that we should collect that money and instead rebate it through a formula that's like this, to where we give back fixed amounts to the people that have their single residence. And then we give a rate back to the people that have other property based on the percentage of taxable income they have in the state of Montana. And the legislature can determine how much money goes to each of those. But when we give money back by lowering the levy on schools, we're giving relief to taxpayers. Like if you take the 17 mills we're looking at for schools, you lower a house in Yellowstone Club by $3,500. We give that $3,500 away to somebody out of state that's not in the income tax system. Then we end up with everybody in the state having to pick that up either through income taxes or some other means of paying that, because any money that we have leave the state of Montana has to be made up by the people that are in the state of Montana that are participating in both systems. And so that's what the whole purpose of this is to take a look at that. And I think this would be a means of whenever we have extra revenue, instead of lowering rates, that we take and instead find a way to disperse it to just people that are participating in both tax systems. So in order to do that, the first step that we need to do would be to set up, if you want to go to that first step there, the first thing we do is start collecting the taxes through the TAP system at the Department of Revenue. And that what that would do would be allow for the state to be able to administer how much money they're participating to lower those taxes, rather than the counties on federal. The difference is right now, county collects the taxes and they disperse to the state the portion that belongs to the state, the schools. This way, the state would collect that money. It'd still be billed by the county, but it'd be paid through the TAP system. And that money would then, the state would collect it, give the money to the county that belongs to the county. The county doesn't have any effect on revenue or anything like that. They'd still be exactly where they were. But that way the state could provide the funding through the school side of things and collect it that way. What that does is what we had happen is when we gave $675 back to homeowners, they got it in a check. 5 months later, they get billed for additional taxes on their house and they're upset. If we do it through the TAP system, that reduction would be there on that house in the reduced amount there on the TAP of what they would pay. And they'd be able to see exactly the amount of reduction that was given to them. The other thing that would do is by having that amount paid reduced, the people who have escrow accounts with their mortgage, the escrow account wouldn't go up because they're only going to charge them for what is paid out. Where right now, when they get that check for $675, what happens is they got that check, but their escrow account went up, and all of a sudden it looks like they're paying more money. And so you're gonna have to have a system to where that money could be collected and seen where that reduction is and matched together. And I think the best way to do that would be through the TAP system. It's gonna take a while for people to get used to that, but it might be a movement that would be worth taking a look at for the legislature, to where we'd be able to provide relief to Montanans that see it as a reduction on the bill. Because as you can see, when you mess with each of these individual things, it affects quite a bit. Like if we take and lower houses, just say we lower the residential rate from the 1.35 down to 1, what it does is it reduces the amount of revenue for schools, but for the county and the city, it just means it was a shift to the other taxpayers. They'll participate some of that shift themselves, but it'd be a shift there. Where this way, what we can do is, instead of giving relief to the system and gives relief to everybody, we can have a system that we relieve people that participate in both the property tax and the income side of that. And I think that we need to take a hard look at that type of thing. Because what it does is, let's just say a third of the revenue is coming from people that don't participate in both systems, okay? Because we got a lot of high-end properties that pay tax. We got a lot of people that, businesses that aren't 100% in Montana that would only get a portion of that money back. Okay, let's just say a third of it comes from elsewhere. What that does is increase the relief to Montanans by about 50% additional, because of what they'd got. But when you take that third and add back, they'd be basically getting about another 50% than what they'd have got before. And I think that's the only way we can get effective relief to Montanans in their pocket. And so that's what it is. I'm sorry I couldn't run the presentation, but I think that pretty well explains it. You got the slides you can look at, but I think that explains where we're at. And, you know, the purpose is to get the money to the people in Montana and not to have it leave the state and go to out-of-state taxpayers, you know, because we just have to pick that up. We've got the same cost to run the state, whether we collect it from everybody or we collect it from just the people in Montana. So we want to make sure that everybody participates in paying it, and we give relief to Montanans. And the flat relief we talked about for homeowners, it takes and reduces there'd be more relief for the elderly and low income that are typically the homeowners in that area. But this provides for all relief, and it doesn't affect local governments. So if you got any questions, that's the basis. But I think we should use it rather than raise taxes in order to cause that. We should just take and use it for the purpose of, anytime we're going to give relief to taxpayers, try to find a way to give it to the people that participate both in the income tax and property tax system.
Thank you, Mr. Iverson. Are there any questions for Mr. Iverson? I just have one for you, Dwayne, and that is, you know, you and I have both been watching the tax fairness subcommittee's work, and I think it's the tax fairness subcommittee that has the homestead exemption piece in there. And doesn't that homestead exemption get to, at least in part, what you're trying to achieve? Your objective to be in this case, in the case of the homestead exemption, they're looking to provide relief to a Montanan's primary residence, and shift that burden to out-of-staters, which is part of what that own residential property. So,
Yeah,
so it
well,
seems
what
to
you
be
got
there's
with
some
that-
intersection there between what.
With the homestead exemption, okay, you got to shift within the county and the city taxes too, because you're affecting taxable value. Okay, the county and the city are still going to get the same revenue, but you're going to shift who's paying the tax. Because if I reduce your prop taxable value on your house, then that means somebody else is paying that city and county tax on that. And for the school district, it reduces the amount of money collected. So that means more money has to come from the income tax system, if everything was equal without other movements.
But at least in some, think of school districts now, at least in some school districts, that some of that shift would go to people's second homes or to non-residents that own residential property within the school district.
It would, but it would also shift it to the small businesses downtown, to the farms, all the rest, because you'd be pushing some of that burden for those local taxes there. You know,
Okay,
instead-
thank you. I'm just trying to, I'm just, this is an interesting option. Director Beatty?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dwayne's right. If you reduce taxable value somewhere, it's not like the budget's changed. So we still have to come up with the cash. And that's the problem with the homestead exemption or the Comstead exemption. And it'll vary county by county so badly. Great, we're going after the out-of-state guy. That's awesome in Madison County. Carter County might not be so good, right? And so in Carter County, for example, probably more of the burden would be pushed off on other locals, just on whether that's their hardware store or their farm or their whatever business, right? Whether it be a pipeline or industry or anything. Whereas in your other counties that have a greater deal of non-residents, are more scenic spots, you might call it, would probably, the homeowner would feel less. That's where I think where Dwayne's coming from, is he's trying to find a way to not shift that burden among the various taxpayers in those local jurisdictions, if I'm understanding this right. But he is correct. It's just a shift with the homestead and Comstead. And this is a little different bend on trying to take the money from somewhere else rather than just the property tax system. My jury's out on how we come up with all that money, but I think that's the point to his proposal. Am I correct, Dwayne?
That's correct. I mean, like if we changed the tax rate on, say, the places at Yellowstone Club and all those luxury homes, anything over 5 million, say you went up, that would give you additional money to give a refund. If we take and increase the tax on the stuff that's Airbnbs and stuff like that, those additional revenues would be there. You could take those monies and take and fund it back to everybody instead of lowering rates. It's a rebate to the people that participate in both the income and property tax system. Whereas if I lower the mill levy, then I lower the rate to the people that are just participating in the income tax system. And the Comstead and Homestead, I agree with you totally, that it's just a shift amongst people for those local taxes, and that's a big issue too. And stuff, because they still get to collect their money. And what I look at is when you look at your tax bill, there's apples and oranges in there. When I get an increase in valuation, it doesn't change what I'm gonna pay in local taxes unless it's disproportionate to other changes in other properties. But it does change if it goes up, and I got this fixed mill that comes at me for the 6 mills for the university, 95 mills, and then my county's got 10 mills for this and 5 mills for that, and the city's got 3 mills. But those, that's where, when you change that valuation, you're gonna affect a lot of those things too when you're doing the Comstead and Homestead. And we're shifting that burden to people that they don't have any relief.
Other questions? I have one for Director Beatty. So Director Beatty, I've listened to a couple of tax fairness subcommittee meetings where there's been extensive modeling done on the homestead exemption. And maybe I'm misunderstanding the numbers I'm seeing that have been produced there. It sounds from you that you have some serious reservations about the homestead exemption.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would, serious reservations is a tough word. I just don't think any of this is a silver bullet, because we do have, I've seen the models. Obviously, I've looked at all that stuff too. I haven't been able to attend those as often because of other duties here, but it is a shift. And if the shift is at the will of the people, that's great, right? That's why we're in this process. But if we have a reduction, just fundamentally, if we take $100,000 off every house in whatever county of taxable value, and the counties and the schools and every other levy jurisdiction still has a budget of the same, you have to come up with the money somewhere. And that money comes from the other taxpayers. And I think it shifts among the various counties. We live in such a diverse state that's the problem. It's really hard to analogize Gallatin County with Sheridan County. And those differences will be different between those two counties. So if we take taxable value out of one class, yet we still have a fixed budget, that burden will be pushed off onto the other taxpayers. Now,
So
go ahead. Sorry.
Director Beatty, if so I'm wondering is and I'm just trying to recall, I mean, these are pretty extensive spreadsheets and I'm not on that subcommittee, so I haven't downloaded any of them. I take your point. I understand your point exactly. Is our modeling, or is the Department of Revenue modeling robust enough to be able to demonstrate those shifts? Because we were looking primarily at the influence. What I remember is taking a look at the impact on residential property. It would be great. I think it's essential that we model this and see where the shifts are to other classes of property.
Thank you, Mr.
That would
Chairman.
apply to the homestead exemption, and I think if Mr. Iverson's effort's going to go forward, we need to model it as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would agree. I have a magician in Eric Dale and his gang. I'm sure we have a way to model at least an approximation of that. Where Dwayne's proposal is different than the homestead is, make no mistake, his proposal raises taxes on a specific class. Whereas like a homestead or Comstead Comstead exemption will spread that additional burden across all of the other classes, right? And actually, to some extent, that class as well, because as mills go up, that property class may get $100,000 or whatever dollar exemption from its value, the budget's still the budget, and it'll be squeezed out among the mills, spread across all of those properties. And I'm not even sure I said that in English, so I apologize. So Eric Dale's face is on the screen here. I think he might be able to answer a couple of your questions there, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Beatty. Eric.
Yeah, I agree with Director Beatty. Essentially, the homestead and Comstead model that we've been working on in the tax fairness subcommittee would fundamentally shift the shares of the pie, if you will. So there would be a lot of tax shifts, but I think that's kind of the point. And that compares with the Big Sky relief program that Mr. Iverson's proposed, that would fundamentally raise taxes on everybody and then redistribute some of that to not everyone, but a lot of people, if that makes sense. So where they'd fall out on net is kind of the details that would need to be determined. But does that answer your question? I hope.
Yes, thank you. Other questions or comments? Director Beatty.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to clarify, Eric, can you actually do a reasonable approximation model on how that'd shift, or how this shift we've just been discussing would show up in a few, I don't know that you can do it statewide, but can you pick a few maybe diverse counties for something like that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Director, we've done that, yeah. And so here, let me share my screen real quick. And this is, broad statewide kind of numbers, but and there's several assumptions that sort of go into these numbers, but I can share it with you real quick just to get an idea of what we're looking at. All right, hopefully everybody can see the spreadsheet here. So, and this goes back a little ways, and I'm not sure if the idea is still the same as it was before, but the idea was there are two ways you can get a rebate. It was my understanding. The first way is that you say you are a primary residence and then you get a flat fixed amount dollar, similar to the $675 or what have you. So that amount's modeled right here if we based on the rebate amount. So for in this example, if we said everybody gets a $750 or every primary residence gets a $750 rebate, that would cost an additional $157 million. Now, the second way to get a rebate, based on my understanding of this proposal, is to essentially increase the mills that you charge on everyone, including the primary residence and all other property, and then you rebate that increase in mills back to those taxpayers based on the proportion of their income that came from Montana. So in this example, there was 1.5, almost $1.6 billion in taxable value for Class 4 residential property that was not associated with a primary residence, if that makes sense. So if we assume we were going to rebate 110% of the increase back to these properties and assumed that 89% of the income associated with these owners was from Montana sources, then they would receive a rebate of $135 million. And that's true for all these different classes as well. And this is where it really becomes important figuring out what assumption you want to plug in here with the amount of income that is from Montana. So, mine proceeds, for example, the mines probably have a lower share of their overall income from Montana. But in any event, those are the assumptions we came up with. So under this example, we said, okay, we're going to raise the state mills by 87.68 mills, and that would generate an additional state revenue of $410 million. Given the rebates for primary residents and all other property taxpayers, you would be rebating back an additional $410 million. And that comes out to approximately revenue neutral, if you will. But you could change that to, if you only wanted to do 20 mills and see where that would go, then you would be rebating out more than you would bring in revenue, if that makes sense. So that's the analysis we've done thus far, if that helps clarify some of that. Looks like Mr. Iverson has a hand up.
Yeah, with that up, okay, the one thing I look at is, okay, when you take that Class 4 residential, okay, when you take the remaining property after you take out the residences, that's where we got a lot of the trophy homes and stuff like that. So that number could be down in the 60s, and stuff. And that's the stuff that we need to perfect in there. But the other thing that what I'm saying now is, instead of charging additional money, if we're going to send money back to people, this is formulas that we could use to rebate that money to the people without, by keeping the money to people who are in state versus the people that aren't participating in the income tax system. And that's what my proposal is, because I don't think anybody's going to be willing to raise the taxes in order to be able to create this, because everybody up for election right now would get shot if they were, because people don't hear anything about other than raise the tax. But this, I think if we're doing rebates, we need to look at, instead of lowering rates, use something like this to rebate to people that are participating in both systems.
Thank you. Senator Marshall?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out one thing that's, it's a detail I think would need to be addressed, is across Montana on or Indian reservations, there's a lot of people who actually own fee property, have primary residences and have fee property, but they pay federal taxes, they pay property taxes, but their income might not be taxed under the state of Montana. So we'd have to figure out how to remedy that.
Thank you, Senator Marshall. Director Beatty?
One last thing, and Eric, thanks for the breakdown there. One of the items that we'll want to keep in mind too, and it's often lost in all of this political rhetoric flying around here, is when you raise the property tax on a utility, they by law are permitted to pass that right through on their utility bill, right to the person, whoever's paying the electric bill or the gas bill or what have you. And so when you hear all this rhetoric about the utilities aren't paying their fair share of property taxes, actually you, the ratepayer, is paying the utilities property taxes in our regulated system. So one of the things we would have to make sure is, if I don't think I would be interested in jacking the property taxes on an electric utility and then not giving those back to the ratepayer, because at the end of the day, that ratepayer paid those. And that's at a 12% tax rate, mind you. They are at a very high rate. So there's some there's some details here that I just want to put in front of everybody to make sure that we're cognizant of all of the tricks in here to make this work. Fundamentally, I think Dwayne's onto something. It's the practicalities that we really need to work on. Thank you.
I have a question for Eric. So Eric, if we were to move Mr. Iverson's Big Sky relief project forward, what kind of modeling efforts would be necessary for us to give it the same sort of a level of analysis that we have for that you put into the homestead and comstead exemptions?
I think, Mr. Chairman, I think we could make the two analyses look similar if that's kind of what you're after. I mean, fundamentally, the Big Sky relief sort of model, if you will, would be a lot simpler, and so could be done because you're not changing as many aspects with the homestead and comstead type framework. What you need to do is you need to figure out what those mill shifts will be, right? So you need to figure out what the impact of reducing the primary residence share of the overall tax base is for all the taxing jurisdictions that have those properties, and then recalculate what the mills would need to be under the Iverson or the Big Sky relief sort of framework. That's a lot simpler because you're, based on my understanding, you're either simply just rebating a bunch of money back, which is easy enough to figure out, or you're increasing the overall mills of the equalization. So we can make them look similar if that would give you a better apples to apples comparison without too much work. The real interesting thing would be how they would work together, right? So like if there was a homestead and comstead proposal in addition to this framework, there could be some interesting sort of ways those programs would interact that would be difficult to model, but hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, just my somewhat uneducated view of this is that these two ideas actually are alternatives to each other. It would seem to me. I guess you could try to merge them together in some way or another. So what I understand here, and I could be way off on this, on my first comment here, is that perhaps, and I will say that there seems to be, from what I've heard just listening to other subcommittee member meetings, a good deal of enthusiasm about homestead and comstead exemptions. But what I'm hearing here today is that we maybe haven't thought our way through those for second order effects as much as what I've seen presented at other meetings. And I may have just missed something. So I think that's probably something that needs to be addressed and brought to the attention of the full PTAC. Director Beatty.
I sure don't want, Mr. Chairman, I sure don't want to allude that people like Representative Jones haven't thought through what they're doing, because I've never seen that guy not think through anything.
I want to
make sure I'm not
making a suggestion. I'm sitting here as a member of the committee, having listened to meetings and hadn't really appreciated the second order effects, and it's maybe because I wasn't attentive enough. But I think these are valid and important considerations that need to be highlighted, and I intend to make that. I think that needs to be highlighted at our next whenever we talk about the homestead and comstead exemptions.
I would agree. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So my initial impression on the Big Sky relief program is that, and I'm sorry that I have to use the term political, but what's politically possible is a consideration that we have to eventually must take into consideration as well as we put together a package of options. I think this becomes a hard sell. On the other hand, there seems to be, I think Mr. Iverson is definitely on to something here. And I guess I'd just like to get a sense from the committee as to what, how we should proceed with this particular idea.
Mr. Chairman. Oh, sorry. I'll let you
Director,
call on
yeah,
it.
Director Beatty, please.
Sorry about that. Mr. Chairman, I would propose that we take this forward. This problem we're addressing, and to some extent, in my opinion, as Director of Revenue, and my own personal opinion, not that of anybody else's, is some of this is a perceived problem, but it is a problem nonetheless. And I think if we're going to ever make any real progress on changing the system we've got, I suggest we take something like this forward. You've all heard me, or probably everybody's heard me ad nauseum saying, we're pounding a 20th century tax code square peg into a 21st century Montana round hole. This is not the Montana of my youth, where we had coal mines, gold mines, oil fields, timber mills, all that were a big implement dealerships prior to the CRP program. We had a lot more diverse taxpayers historically in the state of Montana that underwrote a lot of local government bills, whether it be schools, sheriffs, you name it, streets. Unless we look at something fundamental here, all we're doing is nibbling around the edges. Dwayne's suggestion may have some massive holes in it, but unless we take it to the big picture, all we're doing is nibbling around the edges of something and still fooling around with a tax code that was built around the Montana of our youth, really. And Bozeman doesn't look like the Bozeman of my youth, trust me. So maybe we take this forward to spur the discussion.
Thank you, Director Beatty. Is there any objection to that suggestion from other members of the committee? All right, here's what I think we should do, and unless there's objection, we will forward this as an option for further consideration. I think for this to actually have a chance of being part of the final recommendation going to the governor, we're going to have the numerical analysis that supports it. And so what I would ask Mr. Iverson is be prepared to make your, and by the way, I need to make sure I have time on the agenda for you on the 4th of June. So I will endeavor to do that. It's same for Mr. Melton on the options he's pitching as well. But I think that unless we can get some analysis to support your concept, I think we're going to have a hard time taking this across the finish line within the context of this task force. That doesn't mean that it couldn't go across the finish line later through a separate legislative route. But I think that's just to be realistic here. I think that it needs to have the same level of analysis that other options like the homestead and comstead exemptions have already been put to them. Mr. Iverson?
Yeah, the one thing is, I'm no longer proposing that we raise taxes to do it. I'm just saying this is the way to give the relief once we have more revenue. And if we take and raise the taxes on those other houses, the Airbnbs and the luxury, the stuff over 5 million, it's a way we could get that money back to the taxpayers and give relief to Montanans rather than raising rates to everybody. Because I don't think raising rates to everybody is palatable.
I would agree. All right, so we will, without objection, I will figure out a way to move this one forward. So Mr. Iverson, be prepared. And Eric, I think that Mr. Iverson may need some more assistance from your shop there and putting something together. We'll see how that works out. Good. Thank you, Mr. Iverson. By the way, I did not ask for public comment yet, and I need to do that. Mr. Story, do you have anything? There's your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do. I think since Dwayne's changed the proposal significantly since it first came out, and probably since the slides that you need to refine it down to what he's really talking about. You know, if it's not a tax increase on everybody, it's a different animal. You know, it's basically just a rebate program, not a different methodology of creating tax relief that it started out to be. So, I mean, I'm just leery of any kind of proposal that raises taxes to give money back, because first of all, it just doesn't make much sense to take money away from people and give them back to them, but you're taking from some that aren't going to get any back. What I really wanted to say about, and I think this has fallen off the table and without the revenue side of it, is that, you know, I was the guy that promoted about 25 years ago a plan where local revenue flowed into Helena and then flowed back, the entitlement share program. And if this program followed that methodology, where you're going to take all the property tax revenue, the $2 billion in property tax revenue, and bring it to Helena and then send it back, I think there's be a lot of resistance out there from cities and counties and schools in every other jurisdiction, because it's, you know, while the state has pretty much held up its share of its promise on the entitlement share, they dumped the block grant program for schools, and that caused some tax changes out there in the arena. You know, so I think you need to, if this is going in front of the full committee on the 4th of June, you need to rework it and get it down to what it really is proposed to be, not what it started out to be, and is no longer. And so that's going to take some work. I think Eric's model works pretty good. If you still want to leave a component in there for statewide tax levies, you just put that in as a variable and put it at 0 for now. And if somebody wants to put it at some other number, they can, but it, you know, that's a pretty easy variable in the model, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from members of the committee or any other public comment? Well, I agree with Mr. Story. I think, yeah, you're refining this to exactly where what the proposal is now, and I'm still very intrigued about the interplay about the details of this and exactly how it would work. So by the 4th of June, we'll have more details and have a chance to look at that more closely. Okay, moving on to our next item. I just have a couple reports here coming from work being done by other committees that has some correspondence to what we're doing. And I know that Megan Moore, I think Megan was on, and Pad is on as well. I don't care which one of you speaks, or you can both speak. Pad, why don't you start?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Megan and I decided it might be better for me to go first, but Megan needs to be promoted to panelist. Nancy, if you can make that happen. These are just updates from the two committees that Megan and I staff. I staff the Education Interim Committee. I'm going to read to you exactly what I communicated to the Education Interim Committee in March as part of our kind of biennial cleaning up school funding statute work that we have done the last 5 interims in consultation with OPI, and specifically Paul Taylor at OPI. One of the cleanup proposals read like this: there are a number of artifacts of prior school funding regimes related to state and county equalization levies and aid, equalization advances, etc., found in Title 20, Chapter 9, Part 3. Examining these remnants and modifying, removing, making sense of them would be a great interim accomplishment. This may involve coordinating with school funding and property tax proposals coming from the Revenue Interim Committee or the Governor's Property Tax Task Force or others. So I think that's exactly what we're accomplishing today. I will tell you that going into this examination, I was pretty convinced, and I think maybe others were as well, that it would largely be a removal of some artifacts, as I referred to them. And thanks to some navigational assistance from Mr. Story, who pointed me to Madeline Quinlan, who in turn pointed me to a 1992 July special session bill that created these advances of county equalization aid. I think it's going to be more that we have made sense of them and that we will carefully perform a little bit of more minor cleanup than maybe I had first envisioned. And I think there are a couple of significant takeaways of relevance to this group and your larger full task force. There is a memo posted that goes through this in greater detail on this subcommittee's webpage. The two takeaways are this: the 55 mills are different than the 40 mills. I think you all understand we've got 3 sections of statute. We've got the 33, the 22, and the 40. The 33 and the 22 are considered county equalization aid, and they are an important piece to maintain. There was the idea that maybe the 95 could all be unified, since we all talk about them in a unified manner, and all of the revenue comes into the state to the Scepter account now and is distributed to schools. However, keeping the 55 mills separate, the 33 and the 22, allows those to be considered local effort for federal funding purposes, specifically for the impact aid program that brings in $50–60 million to some high need, low wealth districts in Montana. And so maintaining that separateness of the 55 mills so that they can continue to be considered local effort in this larger scheme is important. And the reason that this complicated mechanism of the state providing advances of this aid and then the counties repaying those advances as well as remitting any excess, all has to do with the cash flow difficulties of property taxes coming in twice a year, in the bulk of them coming in just twice a year. It was important for schools to have access to money earlier in the school year, hence the advances from the state. And then when the property taxes from the 55 and the 40 mills come in, to remit the entirety of those again to the state. So I would say, and I think this just needs to be examined carefully and thoughtfully, if there are any changes to the 95 mills, for instance, if there is a proposed decrease to the 95 mills, my counsel would be consider having that decrease entirely on the 40 so that you're not negatively impacting local effort for federal funding purposes. And similarly, if there's any proposals to increase the 95, you might want to consider increasing them on the 22 and the 33 so that local effort is reflected to be higher for those purposes. All of that needs to be carefully considered, and other folks other than me need to weigh in on that. But Mr. Chair, the Education Interim Committee will get something of a cleanup bill at its June 19th meeting here in the Capitol related to these 3 sections of statute. But it will be technical cleanup and fairly minor. That's my report, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Pat. Megan?
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. So I'm going to pick up where Pad left off a little bit with the Revenue Interim Committee. They actually requested information about combining the equalization mills, and that's what led Pad down the path of looking at those statutes. And I looked at a different portion of those statutes, which is the non-levy revenue associated with the county equalization mills, the 55 mills. And just to define non-levy revenue, this is generally revenue from a source other than property tax levies that has a connection to property taxation. And for the purposes of these sections, it includes federal payments, state revenue from a shift away from property taxation, and payment in lieu of taxation. And there is a report, a 3 or 4 page report on your PTAC website about the non-levy revenue that I prepared for the Revenue Interim Committee. So after hearing from Pad about the accounting concerns and the local effort concerns, and then delving into the non-levy revenue a little bit, they decided against recommending combining the levies, but they did request a bill draft that would deposit this non-levy revenue associated with the county equalization mills into the school equalization and property tax reduction account. When House Bill 587 passed last session, the non-levy revenue was left in the being deposited in the general fund. Just so we put this in context, in fiscal year 2023, it's about $12 million. And the idea is kind of just to keep all the money together in one place. So I'll be presenting a draft on that at our June meeting, and Mr. McCracken and I will coordinate on the changes so that the drafts are unified and will work together. And then the committee will decide whether to advance that as a committee bill. And then I have one other topic that might be of interest to this committee. At the May meeting, I also presented a draft on removing the 95 mills from 1510-420 so that they would just be set in statute at the numbers they currently exist at, the 95 mills. The committee did discuss the draft, however, they didn't take any action, and there's a chance they could take action in the future, but they seem to be undecided about the policy and what their thoughts were on it at this point. And happy to take any questions about my report.
Thank you. Are there questions for either Megan or Pad on the reports they've made to us? Well, thank you. Thank you for those reports. Yeah, we'll watch with interest to see what the Revenue Interim Committee does with that bill draft request that you alluded to that intersected with 1510-420. Of course, the local government subcommittee is also going to be taking a look at 1510-420, and so clearly there'll be some intersection there as well. We have come to the end of our agenda here. I'm going to ask once more for public comment on anything that we've covered this morning. And I'm not seeing any hands up right now. So I want to thank everyone for spending so much time here this morning. I think it was useful time. I really want to thank Mr. Melton and Mr. Iverson, Julia Pattin, and of course Pad and Megan for providing us useful information. I think that we had good discussion amongst the committee. The next, we will not set a meeting for our subcommittee until after the 4th of June. I think on the 4th of June, I anticipate the full committee taking whatever input we have and perhaps deciding on which courses of action to go to pursue, because we're on a pretty tight timeline. My plan is to reach out or to provide feedback to the members of the subcommittee by the middle of next week in terms of the specific information I intend to present at the 4 June meeting. And of course, I will try to give you enough time so you can tell me I got it all wrong, and I can redraft the stuff I have in place. Any other, if anything else from members of the subcommittee? Nancy, I'd like for you and any budget office folks that are on to please stay on the call here. I'd like to talk to you just for a few minutes after this. But with that being said, this meeting's adjourned, and I would ask that all of you, except for Nancy and budget office folks, go do something more fun than sitting on a Zoom meeting for 3.5 hours. This meeting's adjourned.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hey, Nancy.
Would you like me, question first, would you like me to end the meeting?
No.
Okay.
So Nancy,
But in the recording.
end the recording, please.